Hello everyone, welcome to IAS Baba. This is a series of rapid revision, and in these two classes we are going to learn about Indian polity, governance and the associated part of constitution. Well, you all know that Indian polity and constitution has considerable weightage in your prelims as well as mains. Since this is prelims oriented, so this is an attempt by IAS Baba to make sure that there are certain important topics which might appear in your examination. I'll try to cover almost every single part of constitution, but there are certain things which might be beyond that, because we never know UPSC can ask any questions from it. I'm not giving a disclaimer, but it's just an attempt to make sure that it helps in your revision. All right, so we will start from the basics and then we will go on for each and every topic. We will cover all the three important parts of legislature, executive and judiciary. Apart from that, we will try to understand about the current affairs related part. So this session, the first session will be more on static part. The second session is a combination of static as well as the current affairs. So the focused areas where the previous year questions have come in, and then also some of the topics which were in news, especially on the disqualification of a member of parliament and related to the Representation of People's Act, that is People Representation Act of 1951 and 1952, and anti-defection law, and then related to political parties, election commission and so on. So that we'll try to cover it up in the second session. So in the first session, so those things are the important current affairs related part. Well, the static part is where we'll be covering it from the first session. So how do you make use of this? You have to make sure that you have covered all of your concepts. This is just a revision, so that is why it is a rapid revision. All right, so let's begin with this. So we will start with the very first important part of it, and that's where we'll start with the term called as political system, and then also the term called as democracy and so on. We'll begin with the concept of political system and the concept of a state. So what do you mean by political system? Before we understand that, political system, that's polity, is nothing but political system. Before that, we will try to understand the concept of a state. Well, what we understand in terms of concept of a state is related to a government. So we know that the state is nothing but government. However, what we need to understand is the definition of a state, which came in 1930s and 1940s, which is still being used. Well, in 2019, 2020 and 2021, in these 3 years, there were questions related to it, especially on the state, the political system, the concept of the state and the political system. And then beyond that is your constitution, constitutionalism, the constitutional morality and so on. So let's begin with the term called as a state. Now, in short term, we call this as a government. All right, but the definition of a state is where it is a combination of a group of people. Basically, it's a community, and then it comprises of a group of people who are living in a specified area, and that is a specified or a defined population, and this is within a definite territory. So basically, we have two important things here. One is it is a politically organized community, and the second one is it is living in a definite area. And one more thing is it's on independent, it does not have any external control to it, and it has every right to govern its own rules and regulations. So it has every autonomous and independence to make its own government. So therefore, this is where the concept of state involves in. So what we need to understand, we need to concentrate on three important topics here. Three important attributes here. That's the community of people, basically. So that's the people, and these people are responsible to do what? They're responsible to form the government, and these people are living in a definite territory. So this is where the concept of the state begins with. So over a period of years, the concept of state developed into more pronounced form of it, and these pronounced form resulted in various other things, especially in the development of different types of political system, in the existence of the polity. It also resulted in existence of legislature, executive and judiciary, and also the term of the constitution, and it resulted in development of democracy. So the original concept is the concept of the state. So well, this was asked in 2021 prelims. Okay, so which among the following is the definition of the state? So please do understand, the definition of a state is it's an organized community, and it's a politically organized community comprising of those group of people, and these people are living in a definite territory, and basically these people are independent of any external control, and they have every right to form the government, and they live in a definite territory. So this is where the four attributes are involved in. That is, first is a community, the second one is the people, the third one is the government, and the fourth one is a territory. In short, whenever we call as a state, we refer it to as government. And right now we also say that it is the combination of legislature, executive, and judiciary. Now this is where the concept of political system comes into. Political system is basically an institutional framework, and this institutional framework results in combination of three important organs, and which are they? They are the legislature, they are the executive, and they are the judiciary. And what does a legislature do? Legislature is responsible for making laws, that is on legislation. Why are laws important? If you do not have laws, it results in an anarchy. If you do not have any rules or a regulation, it results in a chaos in a system. It results in a chaos in the society. So therefore, in order to have an organized way of society, it is necessary to have a legislation. All right. And what does an executive do? Executive is responsible for implementation of these laws. Since it executes these laws, therefore it is called as an executive. While judiciary is responsible to make sure to act like a reasonable check and balance on the legislature and executive. As in, well, you all know that in a system called of democracy, you have more important rights to the people. So therefore, if there is any law or any rule which is unjust, which is made by the legislature, or any rule which is made by an executive which is quite unjust to any citizen, that's where the judiciary shall interfere and to make sure that these rules and regulation are quashed or made null in order to make sure it upholds the rights of the citizens. So therefore, it's a harmonious balance of all of these three organs, and these three organs will have a definite functionality and a responsibility, and this forms into a political system. Now that we know about the state and the political system, since this is like a one-liner, since I cannot go into a depth of examples and so on, please do revise this, and please do remember the important terms here. And any type of question can be asked by UPSC. So we have just defined the state, we have just defined the term called as political system. Let's move ahead with it. So the next one is the connection of the state and the political system. As I already told you, well, it is all in the declaration. It is all in the system in which the government is. It is all in the system in which the political system is. And well, as I told you, that it forms into a framework, an institutional framework of legislature, executive, and the judiciary, and the process which is involved in this. So each and every country has a different process altogether. Now, each and every country will have a constitution, but then the question is, do they have a democracy? Some countries will have a democracy, some countries do not. Since we have already discussed about executive, legislature, and judiciary, I hope you people remember about this, and also the connection between the political system and also the state. Well, it is all with respect to these three important things, and that's on declaration, framework, and the process. So what's a political system? What's a state? State is a politically organized community which is comprising of a people living in a definite territory who forms a government. That's called as a state. Well, a political system is an institutional framework which is responsible to form into an existence of a system. And this system comprises of three organs, and that's executive, legislature, and the judiciary. What's the connection? The connection is in its declaration, right? The state, what type of a state it is? If I call it as a police state, which we used to see it in India before we got our independence, we call it as a police state, or we might call it as an administrative state, or we might also call it as a welfare state. So India is being called as a welfare state post-independence is because we have more of welfare oriented programs in it. So the connection between the political system and the state is in its declaration, framework, and the process. So let's move ahead with the different types of state. Now, what are the different types of state India had? Basically, India started with police state, and then after that we had the regulatory state, and after that we have administrative state. Of late we are seeing one more state which is called as a welfare state. Now since you do not have more questions on this, but then you should know about this, we never know which type of question come in your UPSC. Well, what's a police state? Police state is a state which gives highest importance to revenue collection and law and order administration. That's called as a police state. It's revenue collection and law and order administration. Well, regulatory state is a state which gives highest importance to that of framing of rules and regulation, and that is called as a regulatory state. However, administrative state is a state which gives highest importance to that of a process and a system which results in delivering certain things to the society, which helps in providing goods and services to this society. Well, we in India, we normally saw a police state during Mughals period and also the British period. Regulatory state, it is between 1947 to that of 1950. Well, administrative state is a state where India reorganized its administrative machinery during the framing of constitution, and after which we saw welfare state, where the welfare state concentrates more on providing welfare oriented programs to the people and also the society. So these are the three types of state. Why are we discussing this? We discussed about the concept of a state. Now these are some of the types of state, what we saw it in India. We will not discuss about the different types of state there, but we will also discuss about the different types of political system. Okay, so let's move ahead. Okay, so the different types of political system in the world, right? It starts with democracy, monarchy, communism, and totalitarian. Well, here communism, totalitarian are one and the same, which is authoritarian. However, it might change, you know, depending on the concept, you know. Well, in terms of democracy, so what do you mean by democracy? It's the people's rule. How many types of democracy we have? We have a direct and indirect type of democracy. We'll come to that, and we'll also discuss about certain important things in India. And then what is monarchy? Monarchy is nothing but the king's rule. Well, what's again in monarchy? There are two types. So in direct and indirect, again direct, there are four important forms of it. You know, which might be tools of direct democracy. In indirect democracy, there are three types of it. You know, well, you have parliamentary system of democracy, you have the presidential system of democracy, and also the semi-presidential system of democracy. These are the three types of democracy which we have in indirect democracy, which is also called as a representative democracy. The word called as representative democracy and indirect democracy is almost one and the same. You know, representative democracy is where people elect representative. They do not appoint, they elect representatives, and these representatives are responsible to make rules and regulation and govern the nation on behalf of us, right? So that's where it comes across as a representative democracy. So in indirect, as I told you, you have you know, the parliamentary, the presidential, and also the semi-presidential. So monarchy is nothing but the king's rule. However, in countries there are two types. Well, we call it as constitutional, and the other one is called as absolute monarchy, or the non-constitutional. Now, what is constitutional monarchy? Britain is an example of constitutional monarchy. UK, that's United Kingdom, is a classic example of it. Apart from that, you have Japan, which is also an example of constitutional monarchy. What is a constitutional monarchy? The king is only for a namesake. The crown is only for the namesake. You know, what happens here? The real power is vested with the Prime Minister. It is always vested with the head of the government. The head of the government is always the Prime Minister in these cases. Well, if at all, if they have a parliamentary system of democracy, right? That's where you find the existence of Prime Minister. You'll also see it in semi-presidential. However, in that case, the President is more powerful than that of the Prime Minister. But then all parliamentary system of democracy, because Britain is where we call it as the Westminster model. So the Westminster model is responsible to be an illustrious of the parliamentary system of democracy for the entire world. So therefore, we find that. So in constitutional monarchy, you should always understand there is a monarchy, but then the monarchy does not have any absolute power. It is not vested with any absolute power. However, in the case of absolute monarchy, that's where the absolute power is vested with. Now, an example of absolute monarchy is you have Saudi Arabia. That's an absolute monarchy. And you also have Kuwait, Iraq. No, not Iraq right now, because Iraq is completely changed right now. It was a dictatorship. Well, it was by a person called as Saddam Hussein. Right now, they've gone into a lot of problems in the nation, and that has been changed into a democracy, but then it's not so called as democracy because you have a lot of problems associated with it. But absolute democracy is seen in case of some of these Middle East countries. As I told you, Kuwait is an example, and you have Iran was also an example, but then Iran right now is called as a theocratic state. That's a different term altogether. It's called as theocracy. Iran is a theocratic state. Can I call this theocratic state as totalitarian? Not all theocratic states are totalitarian. That's different, absolutely different. Totalitarian is nothing but absolute dictatorship, right? While theocracy is religious guided administration. So in case of Iran, what happens is you have a supreme leader, and then the supreme leader claims that he's been appointed by the God. And he controls the entire administration. So this is where, and he runs the entire administration based on a religion. So that is why it is a theocratic state. Now, not all theocratic states are totalitarian. I repeat this. It's because you have certain theocratic states which are non-totalitarian in nature. One example of that is the Vatican City. Because in that case, it's again religious guided administration, but it's not totalitarian in nature. Well, the next one is communism. Well, what do you mean by communism? Communism is a term which is based on the communist ideology, where it gives highest importance to social justice to all. So don't worry about democracy if I have not discussed all of those important terms which I have told you, because we are going to discuss about that in detail. But let me finish these and then we'll go to them in detail, because you will have questions on them in the examination. In the past, he has asked questions on the prelims, especially on plebiscite, especially on right to recall. You should also know about initiative, and there are certain terminologies which are used in direct democracy which is still practically used in some of the countries in the world, especially in Europe. So we'll try to understand how it works. Well, so in communism, it is based on the communist ideology where it is social justice to all. There are different types of communism. There are different forms of communism. The extreme form of communism, which is nothing but the military communism. Now that's again totalitarian. An example of military communism is North Korea and Kim Jong-un, who is the present ruler right now. He acts like a dictator. He is a dictator, in fact, as you all know, and he conducts the administration as a totalitarian form. Totalitarian is absolute dictatorship. They can interfere. What's the difference here? See, monarchy is also authoritarian. Communism is also authoritarian. Totalitarian is also authoritarian. How do you define and distinguish each one of it? Monarchy is a king's rule, basically. Now, in that, there is absolute monarchy and the other one is constitutional monarchy. Where there is a constitution, where the king's rule is just for a namesake, it becomes constitutional. Absolute is where the king's administration is the rule. It might be on a despotism also. The king acts like a dictator there. The crown acts like a dictator there. As I told you about Saudi Arabia, as I told you about Kuwait, and some of these countries which holds an absolute rule, absolute power with the king. The absolute power is vested with the king. Next, communism. What is communism? It is always based on the communist ideology. What is the communist ideology? Social justice to all. What they believe in, they give highest importance to the peasant class. They give highest importance to that of the laborer class. So therefore, you have different forms of communism. I did tell you that one form of communism, Marxist is a ideology. So Marxist form of communism, there is Lenin form of communism, the Stalin form of communism. In fact, the Russian form of communism, they have a direct attack on the imperialistic, that is the imperialism and the colonialism which was done by British in various parts of the world. In fact, Stalin was a strong critic of existence of the capitalistic economy around the globe. So they are dead against the capitalistic economy. That's how the communism forms are. They are different forms of. Well, they are also authoritarian. You do not have a democracy there. So that they are one type of political system. As I told you, the state and the political system has a connection. And what does that connection depend on? It depends on the declaration, it depends on the framework, it depends on the process. They have a different process, and I am discussing those processes right now. Okay, so the last one is totalitarian. Totalitarian is absolute dictatorship. Al-Qaeda is an example of it, ISIS is an example of it, Taliban is an example of it. All these are called as totalitarian. So these are all what we call it as different types of political system which we see it in the world right now. So mind you, what is theocracy? Theocracy is a type of political system which is religious guided administration, where the supreme leader always declares that he is being appointed by the God and he conducts the administration. Okay, so let's move ahead with the next important part of it. So we will discuss about democracy. As I told you that we will discuss democracy in detail. So the first part of democracy is direct democracy. The second part of democracy is indirect democracy. Okay, so what is direct democracy? How it is different from that of indirect democracy? Let's try to understand them. So direct democracy is where the people participate in administration. They participate in the decision-making process of administration. That is where direct democracy comes into. In indirect democracy, the citizens do not participate directly in the administration process. They participate indirectly in the process, meaning what they do is they elect an representative, and this representative is responsible to provide the rule and the governance on behalf of the people. So that's where it's different. Okay, so that's where the direct and the indirect democracy is into. So let's try to understand the forms of it. Now, in case of indirect democracy, we have three forms of it. The first one is called as the parliamentary system of democracy. The second one is called as the presidential system of democracy. And the third one is called as semi-presidential system of democracy. So let's try to understand what are they, and is there any questions which have been asked in the examination. We'll try to understand that as well. In parliamentary system, the very first important thing what we need to understand is the executive responsibility to the legislature. Who is the executive? Executive are the ministers. So in turn, it is the ministerial responsibility. So you should understand it's the ministerial responsibility to the legislature. So for example, whenever there is a session, we have 3 sessions in the parliament, as you all know. That's the very first session is called as the budget session. The second session is called as the monsoon session, and the third one is called as the winter session. In all of these 3 sessions, you should always understand the opposition party leaders or any member of the parliament will ask the minister to answer their question, which is nothing but ministerial responsibility. One of the key part of the political system of the parliamentary system of democracy is the cabinet system, existence of cabinet system. So what do you mean by the term called as cabinet? Cabinet is the most influential body. So it is responsible to have, I beg your pardon, just give me a moment. Okay. The cabinet system is a most important body which is responsible for the highest decision making. For what? For the country. It is responsible for doing the highest decision making for the entire nation. And who presides over the cabinet? It's always the Prime Minister. So the existence of cabinet system is one of the starking feature of this political system. That's parliamentary system of democracy. Now, if you ask me, how the democracy gets ascertained? The democracy gets ascertained through the help of the ministers, through the help of the MPs. Now, you will find here that there are 2 sets of people. One is the ministers, the other one is called as the members of parliament. But you should also understand these ministers are also members of parliament, as you all know. Well, in case of India, we have 543 seats in the Lok Sabha. So what happens here is, out of which all of them are the members of parliament, including 233 plus 12, that's 245 in case of Rajya Sabha. 233 are elected and 12 is nominated, as you all know. And nominated is from literature, science, arts and social service. It's not from sports. I'm pretty sure that you people would have already revised all of this. This is not the time to, discuss why this happened and what happened during those times and all of it. Well, you should remember these facts so that if there is any question which is asked related to it, you should be able to answer. See, there's one change in the nature in 2023, which we can expect in 2024. Earlier, we were not seeing assertion and reasoning questions. That's statement number 1 and statement number 2 and statement number 3. These kind of questions were not to be seen in case of UPSC civil services. That's in the prelims. Last year in 2023, he asked around 2 to 3 types of these kind of question, assertion, reasoning type of question. So well, you should always remember how the concept works. And what is the concept? Have a clarity on this concept. Okay. So for example, what is the starking feature of parliamentary system of democracy? The starking feature of it is executive's responsibility to legislature or ministerial responsibility and the existence of cabinet system. So that is all. So this is how you should keep it in mind, and therefore you should be able to decipher any type of question which comes in the examination and select the right options there. Well, so in terms of the cabinet system, we were discussing about it. So it's a body which is of highest decision making. One of the facts which we need to understand is the term called as cabinet is not present in the Constitution of India. I repeat, in case of the Indian Constitution, the term called as cabinet is not present. Then when it was included, it was added in the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act 1978. So it was added on 44th Constitutional Amendment Act 1978. Where it was added in the Article 352. What is this Article 352? By the time all of you know about this, Article 352 deals with national emergency. Why this was added in the national emergency is basically because it used to happen like the president acted like the puppet of the prime minister. Right? That's the president used to proclaim emergency based on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers headed by the Prime Minister. The Council of Ministers were just a namesake. Whatever the Prime Minister used to say, that was agreed by the President. In order to save that, in order to overcome that, 44th Constitutional Amendment Act 1978 was used, according to which the written approval of the cabinet was necessary if the president has to proclaim national emergency. So this is a reason why the term called as cabinet was introduced. Well, so we see the term called as cabinet being introduced in the Indian Constitution, but then the originality of this was never seen in the Indian Constitution, and neither the Constitution tries to define what is the term called as cabinet. Okay. So next is the democracy ascertained in the parliament. How does the democracy gets ascertained in the parliament? You have various committees here. You have the temporary committees and also the permanent committees. One example is the financial committees, right? Which are the financial committees in India? The first financial committee is the Public Accounts Committee. As you all know, this Estimates Committee, which is one of the largest, it is the largest committee of the parliament because it was asked in one of the examination. In 2015, he had asked which among the following was the largest committee of the parliament. It's the Estimates Committee. And this committee comprises of only Lok Sabha members. It does not comprise any Rajya Sabha members. This is also one more important point what you need to revise on. And we also have the Public Sector Undertakings Committee. So these three committees are called as financial committees. Why the financial committees are important is basically because it checks the accountability. Now what type of accountability are we talking about? The financial accountability. That is the money which is being spent by the government, they're answerable to the parliament. So that's how what we need to question in the parliament is being questioned by the parliamentarians to the government. So that's where democracy gets ascertained in the parliament. So these are some of the features of the parliamentary system of democracy. So let's move ahead with the next one. The next one is called as the presidential system of democracy. So what is the presidential system of democracy? Now example of presidential system of democracy is United States of America. Example of parliamentary system of democracy, UK and UK and India. So well, USA is an example of presidential system of democracy. So what happens in presidential system of democracy? The legislature and the executive, they are independent. In the case of Indian version, they are interdependent, because you will find, for example, our Prime Minister Narendra Modi is a member of parliament from Varanasi, and he is also a prime minister. So he's an executive, a chief of all executive, not the chief of all executive, because in the union executive we call it as the president. Excuse me. Well, he is responsible for making the rules and regulation for the entire India. He is the captain of the ship. Basically, he is the head of the government. So therefore, we have two heads here. One is the head of the constitution. The other one is called as the head of the government. The head of the constitution is always the president, while the head of the government is always the prime minister. But in case of presidential system of democracy, you will not see this. you will find the executive and the legislature being completely independent. So what does an executive does? Executive only implements the rules and regulation which is made by the legislature. What does the legislature does? Legislature makes only the legislation. It makes only the rules, regulation, and also the law, which needs to be followed by the executive. So American president will just give information related to laws, and he has to sign all of these laws which are made by the legislature. He cannot introduce any law in the legislature. While in case of India, any minister can initiate a bill inside the parliament. While in case of America, the president or his counterparts can never initiate any legislation, any bill inside the legislature. So this is where we are completely different. So therefore you will have only one head, who is the head of the government and also the head of the constitution, and who is none other than the president of United States of America. And that's where you will have sole head, who is being the head of the government and also the head of the state, and the executive power of the entire union is always vested with the president. Legislature makes only legislation. Now, what's the disadvantage with respect to this is, probably you might see friction between the executive and the legislature. You will not see that kind of a friction between executive and legislature in case of India. We see it, in terms of the opposition party is trying to stall the process of the session and so on. And the same thing goes by the ruling party, who does a blame game on the opposition. It keeps going on in India. But, all these rules and regulation gets passed in a stipulated time period. Here also it gets passed. However, there are chances of friction between executive and legislature, which has resulted in a case of some kind of a standstill. An example of this is during Barack Obama's period, and also during the period of Donald Trump. It resulted in some kind of a shutdown of administration, American administration for 10 days or 15 days. Now, this is where we are different from that of the presidential system of democracy. So what is more advantageous, parliamentary is more advantageous, is because parliamentary system of democracy always prefers to that of continuity. And maybe the presidential system of democracy is more stable. However, the advantage of the president taking an advantage or becoming like a dictator, the chances of all of that is gleam in the case of parliamentary system of democracy, or the prime minister trying to become like a dictator, at least on paper, is gleam in case of India, while in case of America, the president can tend to become a dictator. There are examples to prove that. One example of that is, as you all know, that when Donald Trump was the president, he tried to, appoint one of his best friend as the judge of the Supreme Court. These are certain examples to it. So let's move ahead with the next important thing. The next important thing is democracy, direct democracy. Now, as I said, what are the important things in case of direct democracy? The four important attributes, the four important tools which you use in this are right to recall, initiative, plebiscite, referendum. Now, the question is, amongst all of them, what do we see in the Constitution as legal? Now, right to recall, it becomes legal. Now, do we see it in case of Indian Constitution? Now, in terms of implementation of it, we have already seen it. An example of that is, what is right to recall? Let's try to understand the concept first, and then we'll try to go into which state used it and so on. Right to recall is a concept where, if people within a constituency feels that the elected representative is unable to deliver the goods and services, or who is unable to do an administration for the society, for the citizens. In that case, if more than 50% of these people who are voters, eligible voters, if they appeal to the Election Commission of India, then the Election Commission of India can recall that elected representative, meaning there'll be a re-election. There'll be an election one more time. So it means that he will not complete his 5 years of period. So this is called as right to recall. Right to recall is an attempt which is seen in case of direct democracy. We see it in Switzerland. We do not see it in India, of course. We see it in India. Now, do we see it right to recall in India? Yes, we see it. I repeat this. We see it in local bodies, not in MLA and MP. Only local bodies. We saw it in Haryana, Rajasthan, where, for the Sarpanch, when people were unhappy about the Sarpanch, they changed the Sarpanch. To that extent, the right to recall is present in India. It is not absent. But the only thing is, it is absent to the nature that the Election Commission of India has not used it in MLA and MP election. So that's what I meant. And that's what it is. So in case of MLA and MP election, we do not use right to recall. I feel that this is a wonderful tool. Well, this is not the time to discuss all of it, but then for the examination point of view, what is right to recall? The right to recall is nothing but a process of direct democracy where an eligible voter within a constituency or a group of voters have every right to recall the elected representative which they have voted, if at all, if he fails to deliver services to them. Right, so this is called as right to recall. The next one is called as initiative. Now, this is also legal in India. We also see it. An example of that is there are many people who use social media and then they use this medium. Now, I always say that social media is destructive, disruptive, and also disastrous. There's a reason why am I saying, and you can also see what's happening in India related to social media. Well, some of them use social media to create an awareness about certain things which are happening in the society. It might be negative or it might be positive. Some of them, in order to attract the attention of the executive, it might be the Prime Minister or the President, they start asking the netizens to sign a petition. That's called as an initiative. To give you an example of that, in case of Chikmagalur, a district in Karnataka, there's a lady, who is diabetic and who is 50-year-old, and she went to a tourist spot, and then for her shocking thing, she could not find any toilets. So she had to urinate in open, because she was diabetic. And then during that case, what she does was she calls the President of India, Honorable President Draupadi Murmu, to take an action on this and to ask the executive to provide proper services to it. So she started a petition on social media, and people also supported that. Now, these are all initiative. So what happens to the initiative? It is always dependent on the government. But then this acts like a direct democracy is because it pressurizes the people, it pressurizes the government in response to make sure that it acts in accordance to the citizens. It acts in accordance to those people who are deviated of service, who have not got the proper service. So that's where the initiative comes into. Next is plebiscite. Now, there's always a confusion between plebiscite and referendum. Please do understand, both of them is used in case of constitutional deadlocks. So they are used in case of constitutional deadlocks, or they are used in those cases where, there is a political dispute or a political conflict. So this is seeking public opinion. It is seeking public opinion, and this public opinion is passed on to the government so that the government should take an action because people are not liking it. Okay. So what is the difference? So both of them have the same meaning. What's the difference? The difference is, please listen to this carefully. Plebiscite is an initiative by any government authority. Referendum is an initiative by any citizen. That's all the differences. So what is plebiscite? If the government or any authority of the government initiates, again I'm using the strong word called initiative here. If he initiates a public opinion or seeks a public opinion on some constitutional deadlock, it becomes a plebiscite. Okay. If any section of the society or a group of citizens, if they come together and what they do is they seek a public opinion on a constitutional deadlock or any political activity or a political dispute, in that case, or it might be non-political, which is related to the society, in that case it becomes a referendum. So well, you should not bring Sikkim's referendum here. That's a little different because when Sikkim referendum was brought in, Sikkim was outside India. Well, there are cases where referendums were brought inside India also during the State Reorganization Commission. However, the Supreme Court has very clearly said that there is no place for referendum in the Indian Constitution. So to that extent, referendum is not being used in the Indian Constitution, neither the plebiscite. However, the right to recall and initiative are seen in administration. To that extent, it has become constitutional. So because right to recall is used in case of local bodies, well, initiative, we see it in most of the social media. Okay, so I think I've given you different attributes of different tools of direct democracy, right? Most of these cases, we see it in those countries which are forward looking. especially those countries which give highest importance to that of rights to the citizens, the European countries basically. Right to recall is being used in case of Switzerland, while in the case of initiative they use it. Also plebiscite and referendum, we saw it in Europe. Well, Brexit is an example of referendum, right? So that's about the direct democracy. Let's move ahead with the details of the parliamentary system of democracy and how it is different from that of the presidential system of democracy, which we have already discussed in terms of the constitutional angle. Well, what are the provisions which is related to it? The provisions which are related to it is Articles 74 and 75. This is in terms of the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers. Well, in the case of the governor and the state minister, that is governor and the chief minister, we see it with respect to Article 163 and 164. Well, we have already discussed that the ministerial responsibility is responsible. That's ministerial responsibility to the legislature. So any minister is always responsible to the legislature. So that's what we see it. And executive and the legislature are always interdependent in this case. And it is also known as the cabinet government or the Westminster model. And it is also sometimes called as the prime ministerial government. Well, talking about the other important things related to them. So in terms of the features, these are the important features what we see it in case of the parliamentary system of democracy. The first one, that's on the nominal and the real executive, we saw it, and the majority party rule, right? That is one party which commands the majority that rules, the entire government. And then the collective responsibility. What is this collective responsibility? They're collectively responsible to the House of Lok Sabha, and they're also collectively responsible for the entire ministry and department, and also for entire India. Now we are talking about the ministerial responsibility here. Political homogeneity, this is normally seen in case of parliamentary system of democracy. Now what's the double membership? Being an MP and also being a minister. That's where double membership, if you are a part of the government, there is both. That's, you are a part of a minister and you're also an MP. That is the leadership of the PM. And the next point is the leadership of the PM. Normally in the case of parliamentary system of democracy, the leadership of PM is always tested because he's the captain of the ship. And in most of the sessions in the parliament, he always leads the session of the parliament. So that's where the leadership of PM is most important. And in case of bicameral legislature or unicameral legislature in parliamentary system of democracy, the lower house is always dissolved because they have a tenure of 5 years, right? And supposing if at all, if any government is unable to command the majority, it can dissolve within 5 years also. And the oath of secrecy, which is always given to them. So these are some of the important principles associated with the parliamentary system of democracy. What are the merits and demerits of parliamentary system of democracy? So let's try to finish it fast. And these are the merits. The first one is the harmony between the legislature and the executive. What's the harmony we are trying to see in the case of parliamentary system of democracy? Now we normally see, since both of them are interdependent, so therefore there is an attempt to harmonize everything. So therefore harmony between the legislature and the executive. Now we normally see responsible governance in case of parliamentary system of democracy, is because if it is not responsible, then it will be overthrown. Basically those who command the majority. Normally it prevents despotism, it prevents dictatorship. Well, I will not comment on anything about this because we are not into some kind of a mains class. Otherwise we could have discussed more about this. Since this is only rapid revision, I'm just moving ahead with all of these points. I'm just giving you an explanation of all of these points. Next, you'll find broader representation in case of parliamentary system of democracy, is basically because you'll have multi-party political system, multi-party dynamics, and in a multi-political party dynamics, there's existence of different ideologies. So therefore, there is broader representation. What are the biggest disadvantage? Supposing none of them command the majority, if all of these political parties, when they face election, if none of them command the majority, it results in instability. So that's where an unstable government is always a demerit. And there is no clear separation of powers between the executive and the legislature. Sometimes, since it overlaps, there's always chances. The critics always argue that there is dictatorship within democracy. So therefore, no separation of powers is one of the challenging and also the demerits of the parliamentary system of democracy. Now we also see the smallest party being dominated by one largest party. So that we see it in Indian political system is because you can see that in the Election Commission of India itself, since we have two set of political parties, one is recognized, the other one is unrecognized. The recognized political parties are those which get all of these star campaigners. They get more star campaigners, while the The parties which are not recognized, they do also get a star campaigner, but then it is lesser. So therefore, it's a domination of one largest political party on the other. Right? The next one is legislature may not stall the policies and the bills. The reason is because since one party commands the majority in the parliament, now even if some of them raise the objection, the bill is never stopped. The bill is never stalled. Now, you will not cancel the bill. Supposing if one of the government or one of the political party, if it commands the majority, you cannot stop it. So you have to bear with it for almost 5 years. So that kind of a demerit in the case of parliamentary system of democracy. So let's try to see the other things here in terms of which one is better. Why parliamentary system of democracy in India, and why not the presidential system? British system, because we follow the British system, British legacy. That's one of the main reason. And as I told you that it provides more of stability and responsibility. It helps in having a strong consensus between the executive and the legislature. And moreover, it also provides representation to every single political party. So these are the advantages. So that comes across as valid. And that's the reason why the parliamentary system of democracy is being used in case of India. So moving ahead, what are the distinction between the parliamentary system of democracy in India and Britain? Many a times questions have been asked, especially during 2012, 2013 and 2014. You had questions on these areas. So when I am solving the PYQs, you will try to understand them. First of all, what are the distinction between the parliamentary system of democracy of India and Britain? Number one, India is a republic state, Britain is not. So what is republic? Republic is, there are two meanings here. The first meaning is no hereditary head. No hereditariness. So let me write it properly so that you can follow it. So there is no hereditary head. So where there is no hereditary head? Because India is a non-monarchical state, therefore there is no hereditary head. When any country has no hereditary head, it is called as a republic. And it also means that the second meaning is the head of the state is always elected. The head of the state is always elected. Who is the head of the state in case of India? The head of the state in case of India is the president. He is always elected. So that's why we call it as republic. Now, republic has nothing to do with democracy. This is what you need to keep it in mind. Democracy is different, republic is different. Okay? Republic is, does that democracy in any way has monarchical setup? That's the question. So if it has, then it has a democracy but not a republic. Now, if a country does not have monarchical system and has a democracy, it means that it is a democratic nation, and also it is called as a republic. So it also has a system called as republic. Well, that's where there is a difference between Britain and India. As I already told you about the constitutional monarchy, Britain has a constitutional monarchy. So therefore, it's not a republic system. This is very, very important. Okay, the second one, what is supreme in case of India? The constitution is supreme in case of India, while the parliament is supreme in the case of Britain. So what is the meaning of it? So what about the parliament then in case of India? Parliament is also supreme in case of India, but then more than that is the constitution. This is what you need to understand. So let's not try to confuse both of it. So the constitution is most the supreme document in this country. So what is a constitution? Constitution is a legally sanctified document which depicts the vision of the state. It also has important rules and regulation framed for all constitutional authorities. All organs has stipulated duties to perform. Their responsibilities, their powers and functions are clearly defined. For example, if you ask me a question, is the Prime Minister's functionality defined in the Constitution of India? No. The power and the function of the Prime Minister is never there in the Constitution of India. The power and functions of the President is studied. Under the Union Executive, we start with the powers of the President. So we need to understand, how did we get all of this? It's the constitution. So therefore, the constitution is supreme than that of the parliament. Parliament makes the laws for us. However, this law shall be in sync with that of the constitution. Supposing if it goes against the constitution, it calls for a judicial review. And by the way, the judicial review shall be done by the judiciary, provided any person, any aggrieved citizen raises an objection that the law made by the legislature goes against the constitution or hampers his rights. So that's where the constitution becomes supreme. In the case of parliament, in the case of United Kingdom, the parliament is supreme basically because in case of Britain, they have an unwritten constitution. We have a written constitution. I'm not going to discuss all of it. The reason is because this is not a regular class, so that's the reason. So just try to recollect all of them. If you have already studied, I'm very sure that most of you would have studied all of this, and you will be in a revision phase. So if there are any points, you can always connect the dots. Supposing if you have not able to understand anything or any part of it, you can try to get maximum out of it from these classes, these two classes. I'm just revising all of them, all of the concepts you have studied from Lakshmikant, or if you have studied from D.D. Basu and so on. D.D. Basu, I think it's more of analytical, so therefore it will help you more in mains. It will help you in prelims also, but then now you should not study anything. You should only revise Lakshmikant as much as possible. And PM Bakshi in some cases, especially on fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy. I'll come to the end, and then I'll also tell you certain strategies how you should eliminate certain things in UPSC. How do you approach some of the question if you do not know? If you have a certain concept in mind, but still you have a doubt in the option, so how do you approach it? So I'll try to discuss in the second session. Okay. Anyway, so let's come back to this. So the constitution is supreme in case of India. Well, the parliament is supreme because it's an unwritten constitution. India is a written constitution. In written constitution, every single thing is written. You have an article for it. Okay. While in the case of unwritten constitution, not every single thing is written. It is written and it is preserved. It can be changed at any moment of time with the help of the parliament during that time and a date. But in case of written constitution, there is an organized process. Right? If you need to change the constitution, then there is a constitutional amendment which you need to follow. But in the case of the parliament, if the parliament agrees immediately, they'll change it. So that is preserved as it. So it is mostly dependent on convention. What is dependent on convention? The unwritten constitution is dependent on convention. While in the written constitution, you also has certain constitutional convention. However, the constitutional provisions are given the highest importance. Okay. So therefore, it is kind of rigid in case of written constitution because it is already written. So if you need to change it, then you have a constitutional amendment. So that's how it is. Next, the Prime Minister can be either from the House of the Parliament. That's either from Rajya Sabha or Lok Sabha. Once it was asked in the prelims. So please do understand, the Prime Minister can be from either House of the Parliament. While in the case of the Britain, the Prime Minister should be exclusively from lower house. It should be from Lok Sabha only. It should be not from Rajya Sabha. It shouldn't be from Rajya Sabha. It shouldn't be from upper house. It should be always from the lower house. Next, any person can become a minister in the case of India. However, if he has to continue the position of the minister beyond 6 months, then he shall be elected. So that's one important condition which is applicable here. So any person can become a minister in India, provided if he has to continue beyond 6 months, then he has to be compulsorily elected either from Rajya Sabha or from Lok Sabha. However, in the case of Britain, only those who are elected from lower house can become a minister. Upper house is never considered. Okay, so this is one important thing which you need to understand. Last but not the least, in the case of India, there is no feature called a shadow cabinet, but then in the case of Britain, there is always a feature called a shadow cabinet. Now the question is, what do you mean by shadow cabinet? Shadow cabinet is nothing but a cabinet which is some kind of mockery of the cabinet which is present there. Not in the literal sense of mockery. The opposition will have a designated critic for each and every minister, including the Prime Minister. Supposing in the election, the ruling party loses the majority and the opposition gets the majority. those who are the designated critic of various ministers, they will take over the same position. And that's called as shadow cabinet. So on the lines of cabinet, the opposition also has a cabinet which is in preparedness, right? Well, if they get the power, they immediately go to the position of the minister. So that's as simple as that. So they form the cabinet, as simple as this. So that's called as shadow cabinet. So these are the distinction between the parliamentary system of democracy between India and Britain. I'm pretty sure that all of you know about this. Well, let's go with the presidential system of democracy, as we have discussed about the merits and demerits of the parliamentary system of democracy between India and also Britain. In case of presidential system of democracy, as I already told you, that the executive and the legislature are always independent to each other. So there is a clear demarcation between these two, and the head of the state and the head of the government is only one, and who is none other than the president. He runs his administration with the help of advisors. In case of United States of America, one starking feature what we see is an existence of a system called a spoil system. So what do you mean by spoil system? Literally, if I run for the American presidential election, then if I win, the people who have supported me, who have funded me, now I give plum positions in the civil service to them. I give important positions of the government to them. So that's called as a spoil system. Therefore, these people, without getting elected, without getting appointed through a merit system, they get appointed directly because of my own favor. Right? So this is where the favoritism and nepotism is normally seen, and this is called a spoil system. The spoil system is existent in the United States of America even today. Well, you do not have something called as collective responsibility, unlike in the case of India or in the parliamentary system of democracy. They lack collective responsibility is basically because all of them are not responsible to the parliament. They're directly responsible to the people, and in many cases you will also see some kind of right to recall which is being used in American system. And there is nothing called as dissolution in the case of lower house in the presidential system of democracy. You can also see this as a difference between parliamentary and also presidential system of democracy. Moving ahead, what are the merits between merits and demerits of the presidential system of democracy? Well, first of all, it provides a stable government because you will have only two political parties there, right? If one does not, if the one loses the power, the other comes in. So that's where there is a stable government, and there is a clear demarcation between the powers of the executive and the legislature. Unlike in the case of India, we do not know whether the executive is acting like an executive or is in the will of the parliament. Well, here you will have a clear demarcation between the powers of the executive and the legislature, because the executive only executes the law which is made by the legislature. The legislature only make legislation. He or she shall not interfere in the administration or does not take double membership, unlike in the case of India. They have a clarity in case of policies is basically because, what do you mean by this clarity in policies? Why this acts like an advantage here? The clarity in policy is basically because in case of presidential system of democracy, there is a clear demarcation. So this acts like a corollary to this point. Well, the government is always run by the specialist, unlike the generalist in case of presidential system of democracy, is because they always prefer giving more importance to the specialist administration, as there is a clear demarcation of powers in each and every case. Well, in the case of demerits, the biggest problem is there's a constant conflict between executive and the legislature. So this is where it might lead to a shutdown, and I already told you that it led to a shutdown in the past as well. There's always a lack of accountability, and normally it might lead to an autocracy in the system, and it also creates narrow representation. Why it is a narrow representation is because there is non-existence of multi-party dynamics, unlike in the case of parliamentary system of democracy. So these are the merits and demerits in the case of presidential system of democracy. Let's move ahead with the next important topic, that's on federation. So we have completed democracy here, and there are certain points which I have already told you which are important for the examination, especially in terms of the Indian parliamentary setup, about the minister and his qualification and so on. What are the qualifications to become a minister? Including the prime minister, there is no qualification. As a member of parliament, he has qualification. As a minister, he does not have any qualification, and therefore any person can become a minister in case of India, but it cannot happen in case of Britain. We have already discussed about it. Supposing if he has to continue in the position of the minister, including the prime minister, if he has to be a prime minister, then he has to be compulsorily elected if he has to continue his position beyond 6 months. Well, next is federation. So there is one important thing what we have to understand in case of federation, and that is a strong federation and also a federation. Now, whenever there is a term called a strong federation, you should always remember the term called United States of America, which also acts like its example. So what is the definition of a federation? The definition of federation is it's a close association of group of states. For example, if I were to draw this diagram and say that A, B, C, D, E and F are the states and X is a country. Alright, so I hope all of you can see this. Well, it's a close association of group of states. What's a close association of group of states? It's a close association of A, B, C, D, E, F. And this system is called as federation. One of the starking feature or the central principle, it's the central principle. What's the central principle? The central principle is the power gets divided between the center and the state. And who's the center here? X is a center and A, B, C, D, E, F are the states here. This is F. Okay. So X is central government and all of them are the state governments. So power gets divided between these two, and that's where it's a central principle in the case of federation. So federation is a principle. Federation has a principle, and the most important principle is that is the division of power. Division of power acts like the central principle of federation. Please do keep it in mind. So whenever there is a question of federation, strong federation, the answer is United States of America, nothing like it. Okay, and United States of America is also called as a federation, which is coming together federation. While in case of India, the federation is called as holding together federation. Why it's coming together is all of these like-minded states came together and they wanted to form a federation. That is why it is called as the coming together federation. Let's move ahead. So what are the principles in the case of any federal country? What are the federal features? As I told you, the central principle is the division of power. Okay, and each and every setting, now when I say they do not have no right to secede, so this is an important principle. So A cannot come out of this setting and declare an independence and become a separate country altogether. Okay, so that's the meaning of no right to secede. When I say no right to secede, what is its meaning? Each and every state is independent, however, it cannot come out of the structure of X, declare an independence and become a separate country altogether. So that's called as no right to secede. Next, duality of constitution, duality of government. So what do we mean by this? A will have its own state government, B has its own state government, C has its own state government, D has it, likewise E and F. Each one has a constitution of its own. Like how X has its own constitution, A has its own constitution, B has its own constitution. Each constitution is different, therefore it's duality of the constitution. So X has its own constitution while all of these follow its own constitution. Wherever you have a strong federation, therefore you will always have a written constitution. Why it is a written constitution? Basically, if there is a written constitution, the power can be clearly demarcated. Otherwise, there will be always a conflict between the center and the states, also amongst the states. Therefore, in order to eliminate this conflict, what the constitution does is, it is a written constitution, basically dividing and writing in clarity about each and every functions of different types of government here. It's a central government or the state government. Each and every government has its own constitution and the constitution clearly defines its power. So that's what it is. So moving ahead. So well, duality of the constitution and duality of government. States are powerful than that of the states. This is a starking feature in case of federation. The states are always powerful than that of the center. Now why is that? This is a principle you should always understand. Now unlike in case of India, the states are not powerful. It's always the center which is powerful. So therefore, Indian type of federation is a Canadian type of federation. So India follows Canadian model of federation. Unlike in the case of United States of America, where the states are powerful. Since the states are powerful, the residuary power belongs to the states itself. So what do you mean by this? Let's say that there is a subject called as water. Imagine that this subject is not divided between X and none of the states. So all of a sudden, you know, when there is question of decision to be taken and a law has to be made on water, by default the states will have the power to make law on water than that of the central government, because the state governments are powerful. So this is called as the residuary power by default, the power by default. So that's where the residuary power comes into. Next is independence of judiciary. Why do you have an independence of judiciary? If you do not have an independence of judiciary with the existence of Supreme Court, that's the apex court, then in that case there will be a series of conflict. So therefore there is an existence of Supreme Court to solve the conflict between the center and the state. For example, you know, related to the water issue, well, let's take the Kaveri water issue itself. It's always been a conflict between Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, right? You know, what we need to understand is on the constitutional provision, right? The Supreme Court cannot interfere each and every time related to a water conflict, because the Parliament has the authority to make a tribunal, and whatever the tribunal does, that's the final authority. However, due to the conflict, you know, these conflict can be challenged in the Supreme Court. The judgment can be challenged in the Supreme Court. You know, therefore, always the Supreme Court interferes in these cases until and unless it's taken to the ball of the Supreme Court. Now, water here is, you know, not a central one, it's the state, it's a state list, it's a you know, subject in the state list. However, what we need to understand is the constant tussle between two states has resulted the judiciary to interfere. So well, this can also between the center and the state. For example, related to education, though it comes under the concurrent list. Some of the states always allege, especially the southern states always allege, that the state does not consult them, that the central did not consult them when they made this national education policy. And therefore, some of the states, since it comes under the concurrent list, they've continued to have their own state education plan, right? Now, supposing if these kind of things falls in the ball of the Supreme Court, then the Supreme Court shall take a decision on all of this. Well, if there is any case related to you know, conflict between the state and the center, that goes to the ball of the Supreme Court. Recently, the state of Karnataka requested the Supreme Court to provide you know, relief to the drought relief, and the Supreme Court also acknowledged and asked the center to you know, solve all of these through amicable means. And as a willful gesture, the central government released 3,491 crores odd, 3,000 odd crores to the state of Karnataka related to drought relief. Now, this had always been a spat between the central and the state government. You know, there is a question of stepmotherly treatment and all of it. So we're not going into that. Now, what's the federation here is the division of power. Supposing if there is any subject matter, and then if who has the authority to decide on the subject matter, that issue can be challenged in the Supreme Court. That issue can go to the Supreme Court. So supposing if there is any challenge or if there is any conflict on any subject matter which has already been divided or it is not divided, so therefore there is always an existence of the judiciary and the existence of the Supreme Court, and it should be independence of judiciary. Well, a state shall not be divided further into two or more states, especially in the case of strong federation. So what do we mean by this? Now, if you see the structure here, A should not be further divided into A1, A2, A3, and then it can be converted into new states. No, you cannot declare that. So in United States of America, once the states are declared, it's final. Again, likewise, B cannot be divided into B1 and B2 and called as a separate state. Unlike in the case of India, where we have already done it. Now, how we have done it? Andhra Pradesh was divided into Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, and then Bihar was divided, you know, into Bihar and Jharkhand. So these are certain examples. You know, there is also call for smaller states by some of the states as well. So that's a different issue altogether. Well, what we need to understand is in a strong federation, there is no provision as such where a state gets further divided into two or more states. That's what we need to understand. Well, apart from that, the states, in case of a federation, it should always follow a written constitution because the power should be clearly defined. Otherwise, it leads to conflict. So that's the reason why it should always be a written constitution. And normally, in case of a strong federation, it follows bicameral legislature. So is bicameral legislature a feature of federation? Yes. Because in strong federation, they always have a bicameral legislature, and you see it in case of United States of America. So wherever there's a question of federation comes into, you should always remember about United States of America. These are the features of federation. These are the federal features. So I have made an attempt to put in all the features here without removing any of the features. So if you remember all of this, this is more than enough. You know, so these are the important features. So if you remember, the federation concept is completely over. Okay. Well, now let's go to the Indian setting. So how does the Indian setting works? So in case of Indian federation, what do we see it? We do not have a duality of government. That's duality of, we have a written constitution. We have duality of government, that's the state government and the central government, but then we do not have duality of constitution. There is no two constitution. We have duality of government. That's the state government as well as the central government. Well, what do we mean by, we also use written constitution, which is also a federal feature. We have division of power. The power is divided between the state as well as the center. We also see independence of judiciary. Judiciary is independent, not only independent, also integrated in India. That's where there's a difference between India and American constitution. In American constitution, it's only independence of judiciary. There is no integrated judiciary. But in India, we find integrated judiciary also. There is always an existence of Supreme Court. The existence of Supreme Court is to solve the original jurisdiction is where you'll find, you know, it is to solve the dispute between the center and the state. There are two important original jurisdiction which you see it in case of the Supreme Court. One is related to solving the dispute between the center and the state. That is center versus the state, state versus the state, group of center versus group of state, or state and union territory, state versus a union territory, center and union territory versus a state. So these are the things what we see it in case of original jurisdiction. Well, in case of other original jurisdiction, that's Article 32. Now, what's Article 32? That's the writ petition. So these are the two important original jurisdiction what we see. So what do we understand here? The existence of apex court here is to solve the dispute between the center and the state. So therefore, it's a strong federal feature. And we also find a bicameral legislature. I also told you that all federal features, you know, any country which is federal in nature, it will have certain features, and one of that feature is the bicameral legislature. These are the federal feature which is common with that of United States of America. So we have federal feature, and we cannot say that we have more federal features than that of the unitary feature. In fact, our unitary features are more than that of the federal features. So let's see what are the unitary features which we have. Now, first of all, one of the most important unitary feature what we have is a strong center. So this is where our model is the Canadian model of federation. Now, what do you mean by the Canadian model of federation? Canadian model of federation is a federation where the center is more powerful than that of the state. So it is always dependent on a strong center. The central government is always powerful. That's how it works. Well, the second one is the destructible states with an indestructible union. So what do we mean by it? The states can be further divided into 2 or 3 states, but then the union cannot be divided into 1 or 2 or 3 states, 2 or 3 union. So, well, the central government cannot be divided, while the states can be divided into 2 or 3 states. An example of that is, you all know that we saw it in case of Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. We also saw it in Jharkhand. We also saw it in Chhattisgarh. Right? These are examples to say. So therefore, it's destructible states with indestructible union. Union cannot be destroyed into 2 or 3 central government. There is non-existent of 2 or 3 central governments. That's what it is. In case of American Constitution, in case of federal constitution, you follow duality of constitution, but then we always have a single constitution. Irrespective of whichever state you are supposed to follow a single constitution. This is what it is. And the other one is non-equal representation in the upper house. Well, this is not a federal feature, is basically because it is a unitary feature, is basically because in case of United States of America, if you see the upper house, in upper house, they have equal representation. They have 2 representation. That is in case of the upper house of the legislature in United States of America, irrespective of the population, irrespective of the larger area or a territory, each and every state of United States of America has equal representation of congressmen. That's 2 there. While in case of India, there is non-equal representation of the upper house. Okay. Well, next is the emergency provisions, which makes the system unitary. Why the emergency provision is unitary feature is basically because during national emergency, you know, the normal administration or the normal circumstances of the administration is completely abolished. The entire country becomes one. So, in those cases, the central government can provide directions to the state government, the manner in which the administration can be run. So therefore, in emergency provision, it becomes a unitary feature. And we have single citizenship. Now, well, in the case of United States of America, they follow something called as duality of citizenship. Now, the question is, what do you mean by duality of citizenship? Duality of citizenship means that you belong to a citizen of a state and also a citizen of a country. And in some cases, you also hold passport of 2 different countries. But in case of India, there's only single citizenship. Next, integrated judiciary. So apart from independence of judiciary, India has integrated judiciary. That is what I also told you. Because integrated judiciary means that all of them comes under one single arm, and that's the Supreme Court. They come under the platform of the Supreme Court. Well, you will have the subordinate judiciary, especially district courts. Below district courts, you will have subordinate courts. So you have a district court and then the high court and then the Supreme Court. So what happens is the district court are under the control, not direct control, but then they are under the control of the governor. And that's on the state administration. The states have every right to give the promotion and so on. And this is in consultation to that of the High Court. The governor has that power, you know, in terms of the district judges. Well, recently there was a judgment related to this, and they said, Honorable Supreme Court said, that the district courts would also come under the basic structure of the Indian Constitution, which is a very, very important topic for UPSC civil services, is basically because you should also understand the prelude of it, the background of it, and some of the cases associated with it, that is Berubari, and you should also know about the 24th, 25th and 26th Constitutional Amendment Act, the Golaknath case, and then followed by the Keshwananda Bharati case. Of course, we are going to discuss about all of them when we come to Keshwananda Bharati case of 1974. That's where the basic structure of the Indian Constitution came in. Anyway, so why am I trying to say all of this is because of integrated judiciary. So the recently judiciary said, this is for your current affairs, that the district judges also come under the basic structure of the Indian Constitution. Related to it, I'll give you the complete details in the second session, where we are going to discuss about the focus areas, those areas which are in news, especially in the past 11 or 12 months. Well, next is All India Services. All India Services also forms into a unitary feature. Why it forms into a unitary feature? Basically because they're all recruited by the center, but then they are maintained by the state. So the state does not have any right to initiate any disciplinary action against them until and unless there is a strong law associated with it. However, you should always understand they cannot dismiss any officer. Now, any dismissal of all these officers, especially All India Services, that comes under the purview of the center. So therefore, All India Services is a unitary feature. Next is integrated audit system, and we have Indian Accounts and Audit Service, and who presides the Indian Accounts and Audit Service? It's always the C&AG, the Comptroller and Auditor General, and he is responsible for auditing both the central as well as the state accounts. So therefore, it comes across as a unitary feature. Next is Parliament's authority over the state list. This can happen only in certain situations, especially Article 249, which is also the special power of Rajya Sabha. The Parliament has to make law on the state list in the wake of national importance. In the wake of national importance, it can make any law on the state list, while the bill has to be introduced first in the Rajya Sabha. So this also authenticates the point. It also provides an acceleration to another point, that we have a strong center. It acts like a corollary to it. Next, appointment of the governor. The governor is always appointed, and the governor is always said to be holding 2 caps here. Now, what do we mean by this? he is responsible for the state administration, but then he acts like a agent of the center. The governor is appointed by the president based on the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers headed by the Prime Minister, and this governor is responsible to act like a constitutional head of the state. At the same time, he acts like the agent of the center. He has to take all of these orders from the center. So in a way, he kind of controls the state administration. So therefore, these are all the unitary features what we see. Since India has both this unitary as well as the federal features, India is also termed as a quasi-federal state. So this is about the federation and about the Indian Federation. I hope all of you got an important points of whatever I have put on this PPT, and I hope that you people are following this. You can capture all of these slide and then keep it, and then you can revise. So I have brought it all of them under one roof, so you can revise these points. I have not eliminated even a single point here. If you can remember all of them, they all become the unitary features for Indian Constitution. Okay, next. So in terms of other important things, Integrated Election Commission, veto over state bills by the governor, they also come under the unitary system. Now, Integrated Election Commission, that's the election commission which is responsible for conduction of elections for MLAs, MP, also MLC, then the president, then the vice president. These are the types of election which the Election Commission of India conducts. That's the state legislature assembly election, the parliamentary election, the parliamentary constituency, and then the state legislature council, then the president and also the vice president. Okay, and in some cases, the veto which is done by the governor on the state bills, this also acts like a unitary system, basically because what the governor does is he reserves the bill for the consideration of the president. Once he reserves the bill for the consideration of the president, it's the president who tries to control over the state legislature. So in another word, you can also call this as disallowance of the state legislature. The disallowance of state legislature is not complete in the case of India, basically because it's only those cases where the governor is kept under consideration of the president. Otherwise, it is never considered. So these are the unitary features what we see it in case of Indian Constitution. Okay, let's move ahead with the next important topic. So the next is historical underpinnings. So here there are two parts of it, what we need to understand. So I'll go through this fast so that now we have not seen much questions here, but here and there you might see one or two questions, right? So I've kept only on the political developments. We have not taken any historical developments, because I think these things would have already been covered in history. So I'll take only the political developments here. Well, where did it all start? Sorry for the typo here, Queen spelling. The Charter Act, especially the charter, was granted by the Queen Elizabeth, in 1600. So based on which the British first procured the Diwani rights, especially for Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, and post which, when they started ruling, there are a lot of accusation which was going on the British. So you should always remember two important things here. One is a group called as Court of Directors, and the other one is called as the Board of Control. Now, who are these Court of Directors and who are these Board of Control? Court of Directors, you can understand that these are all directors of British East India Company. You can also understand that these are pro-British East India Company. Well, Board of Control are those who have been appointed or nominated by the Crown, the British Crown. So what happened was, over a period of years, when it started with the Regulating Act, why it is called as Regulating Act, it started regulating trade of British in India. So therefore, over a period of acts, over a period of years, as and when there are different acts which are passed, that's when the British Crown started strengthening its control over the British East India Company and also taking over the administration in India. It might be on any activity, whether it might be an economic activity or a political activity, especially economic activity here. So therefore, there are two types of acts, what we see it here. Why these are important? This gives us an understanding of how the Parliament developed, This gives us an understanding of the evolution of our president and the prime minister. This also gives us an understanding of how 3 types of list came in. This also gives an understanding of how the federation came in, how the confederation was seen in case of India, but then we do not see confederation post-independence, right? And some kind of confederation was also seen during Maratha's period and so on, which is called as confederacy. Now, there is a slight, similarity between confederation to confederacy, but then they are little different. In terms of confederation, we see it only in the case of USSR as a political system because they wanted to challenge federation, right? Well, most of it we saw in 1948, 1947, when the Indian Independence Act was seen. We saw the federation and we also saw the different types of lists formed and so on. So by reading these acts, we'll try to understand the evolution of Indian system that is Indian political system. So let's move ahead with this. So the first part of it is the company rule, which is from 1773, that is from the Regulating Act till 1858, where the Councils Act was passed, and from the Government of India Act of 1958 till that of 1947. Okay, so why it was called as the Charter Act? Why this is called as the Government of India Act? The Charter Acts were those acts which were to control the British East India Company, which had little control by the British Crown, while these were the British Crown's direct administration. So that is why it is called as the Government of India Act. So all Crown rule are through an act called as Government of India Act. All British East India Company was an indirect representation or an indirect control of the British Crown. So therefore, it is called as a Charter Act. So let's try to understand each one of them. The first one was the Regulating Act. As the name itself suggests, it tries to regulate the activities of British East India Company, especially on the trade in India, and to regulate the affairs of British East India Company, as the name itself suggests. Now, this was the first act of centralization. So it started centralizing because during those times you had various governors by the British. You had the governor of Bombay, you have the governor of Madras, you have the governor of Calcutta. So therefore, in order to centralize all of them, this was an attempt made by the British government. So what happened was the governor of Bengal becomes the governor general of Bengal. He becomes superior than that of the governor of Bombay, and then that of the governor of Madras. The Bombay and Madras governor were asked to report to him. They were asked to assist him. And for the first time, the British also set up a Supreme Court in Kolkata, which is called as an Apex Court in Calcutta. And apart from that, these company officials who were working under the British East India Company, they were restricted to do any private trade. You're not supposed to do any type of private trade. And as I told you about the Court of Directors, these Court of Directors were responsible to act at the behest of the interest of the British East India Company. Their activities were also regulated. So these Court of Directors were asked to report on the revenue, civil and military affairs in India to the British Crown. So therefore, this was the first attempt made by the British Crown to control the administration in case of India. Okay, so moving ahead. So there were certain deficiencies in these acts. So there were certain maladies in these acts. People raised objections to it. So therefore, in order to overcome these problems, the Pitt's India Act was formed. The Pitt's India Act was implemented. Well, it clearly demarcated, distinguished the commercial and the political functions of the company. Well, the Court of Directors, as I told you, they were restricted only for trade activities. Therefore, they were responsible only for the commercial affairs. While on the other end, the Board of Control, as I told you that these were the nominees of the British Crown, they were responsible for all political affairs of the British India Company. And this Board of Control were given more powers. So therefore, the Board of Control were to supervise and direct all operations for the British East India Company. So there you go. From Regulating Act to that of the Pitt's India Act, the Board of Control is trying to exercise its supervision and also control over the British East India Company. So, well, it is now supervising and directing all operations of the British India Company. And most importantly, all of these companies' territories, which were the British possessions of the Est areas, all of that was supposed to be looked after by the Board of Control. So, these were some of the important things what you saw it in case of the Pitt's India Act. So, Pitt's India Act was brought in by the British in order to strengthen the regulating act and in order to overcome certain maladies and certain deficiencies of the regulating act. Well, moving ahead, the next important act what we saw was the Charter Act of 1793. Now, as I said, more and more control was seen on each act. For the first time, what it did was, it included the Governor General of Bombay and Madras, and they were kept under the Governor General of Bengal completely. And the trade monopoly for 20 years was continued, and the Commander-in-Chief was responsible for the Governor General's Council. He was to be not to be a member of the Governor General's Council. And this Commander-in-Chief was directly under the report of the British control. So the members of all of these board of control now to be paid by the Indian revenues. So earlier what used to happen was these board of control, since they were from the British Crown, they were not to be paid from the Indian revenue. Now they took a decision to control it, and there was a trade monopoly which was very clearly set for only 20 years. So these are some of the important things on the Charter Act of 1793. Moving ahead, on the Charter Act of 1830, it completely abolished any kind of monopoly by the British East India Company. So therefore, the trade on tea and trade with China was only continued. The trade monopoly of company was completely abolished. The British Crown sovereignty over the company territories was undertaken. Well, the British Crown started, giving more and more of importance to the control of the company's territories, especially the British India territories in India. The term called as sovereignty is very, very important to us, is basically because the British sovereignty to us had exposed a lot of system, the lacunae of Indian rulers, in order to have a strong protocol, in order to have a strong rules and regulation. Most of these Indian rulers and Indian kings were unable to control the administration in India. There was infighting, there was, some kind of power lust for each and every territory on the other. So this was an advantage for the British to take over most of the territories, while the British Crown's sovereignty increased over a period of years. But at the same time, the British East India Company's, control over Indian administration started diminishing. And Charter Act of 1813 is one clear evidence of it, is because the sovereignty of British Crown over the Indian territories increased. Now, apart from that, it also allowed Christian missionaries in India. So for the first time, there was an attempt of the Western education. And then this was a time where the local bodies, it had the power to impose tax. By the way, the local governments, they started existing in the late of 16th century. You can say that as and when the British came to India, in the 17th century, you would see all of these local bodies. And local bodies had an existence in Madras first, and then after that, it was in Mumbai. After that, it was in Kolkata. In all of these three important cities, even today, you will find a well-existed infrastructure, especially in terms of proper amenities, in terms of proper facilities. The reason is, British paid an administration role, and most of its family members and their administrative territories. So that was first to be groomed in case of these three cities. They had a strong foundation stone in these three cities. So therefore, the initial local body was supposed to provide amenities to the British, especially to their family members who were located in these cities. And post which you will find it was spread over different parts of India. So, the local bodies got the power to impose tax, especially in the Charter Act of 1813. Moving ahead, the Charter Act of 1833, this was a time where you'll find the Governor General of Bengal becomes the Governor General of India. And in fact, the Governor General of India, he had certain legislative powers as well. So for the first time, the term called as law and act was supposed to be used, but then still it was not to be the Government of India Act. As you all know, the British Crown did not have the complete control over the Indian administration. So therefore, you would see the 1833 Act as one of the important important act which was asked in earlier civil services examination on the district commissioner and the divisional commissioner office. Sir Warren Hastings created the district collector office, while you will find the changes of divisional commissioner, the divisional commissioner's office, which was created. It was created based on the Charter Act of 1833. Well, this is what you see. Well, East India Company becomes an administrative body, purely an administrative body, and it lacks its commercial functions. As you see in the previous acts, their commercial functions were completely devoured, they were removed. It was nullified by the British Crown. And they also tried their level best to create an open competition for the civil service, and that's why we are here. And related to a merit system of recruitment, you would see it in 1853. So this was an attempt. They did not create, they attempted to create. It was not a creation. The creation of a merit system was done by the Charter Act of 1853. So you should not get confused between these two. So the Charter Act of 1853 is where you will find the existence of merit system, and it finally separated the legislative and the executive functions of the Governor General's Council. Now, who is the Governor General here? The Governor General of India. The Governor General of India had executive and the legislative functions, especially a council, and these two were completely separated, and there was an open competition. And this competition was for the merit system of recruitment. And finally, there was a committee which was appointed, and this committee was called as the Macaulay Committee. Why was Macaulay Committee? Macaulay Committee was responsible for many of important things, especially related to civil service functioning, and also related to local bodies, also related to the English education. But then Macaulay Committee here is related to creation of open recruitment system. Right, that is where the Macaulay Committee was appointed, and it also extended the company's rule and retained the position of Indian territories. It introduced local representation to the Indian Legislative Council. So these are the things what you see in case of the Charter Act of 1853. So these acts, what I've told you, from 1773 to 1853 may not be so important, but then what you need to understand is this is an attempt made by the British Crown in order to control the administration from the British East India Company. So let's move ahead with the Companies Act and the Government of India Act of 1858. Well, in the Government of India Act of 1858, let's try to remember through a block diagram. The block diagram goes like this. You have the British Crown here, and you will have the Governor General here, and you will have the governors of various states here, and you will also have the Council of India, and there was a person called as Secretary of State in between. Okay, let me erase this. There's a person called as Secretary of State in between. Okay, and then the Council of India. Okay, and then after the governor, so you will have the Governor's Council, and you will also have, that's the Governor General Council, and then the Governor's Council. So well, from 1858 till 1947, this gets evolved. So what I've written on the board, it gets evolved. So what I've written here is the British Crown here, the Secretary of State, the Governor General, the Council of India, the Governor, the Council of the Governor General, the Council of the Governor. Okay, so this is what I've written. From 1858 till 1947, as I told you, that it gets evolved. It keeps evolving. So in 1858, this was the block diagram. Okay, if you explain this, it becomes a feature of it. So what is British Crown? You all know that the British Crown took over the administration from the British East India Company. Secretary of State, this was a British cabinet member. Basically, he is a cabinet minister. He was responsible for what? He was responsible for the British Parliament. This guy was responsible for the British Parliament. And this British Parliament, now what it did, of course, it discussed about the policies of British India, basically. So the Council of India was responsible for, the Council of India was like an advisory body. This was like an advisory body. What they did was, they used to advise the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State used to tell the Governor General how the administration of India should be. And the Governor General controlled the administration of various provinces through the Governor. To assist the Governor General, you had a council. Like, in the Charter Act, you had like the legislative and the executive council of the Governor General. Likewise, this council, which comprised of high officials, whom you had in this, they're called as high officials. Who are these high officials? You can call them as civil servants. And they used to hold their office during the pleasure of the Secretary of the State and also the British Crown. Okay. So you can't remove them so easily, because these are all, with a certificate. And these are all with a proper contract with the British Crown. You cannot just remove them, right? So therefore, they enjoyed their office, the pleasure of the office, under the pleasure of the Secretary of the State and also the British Crown. So the entire administration, what you see, is a centralized administration. There is no popular participation and it is bureaucratic in nature. This is what you need to understand. So this is an example of absolute imperial control without any popular participation of India, without any popular participation in India. There is no question of any representation here. Okay, so this is one of the features what you should understand about. These are the features what you should understand about the Government of India Act of 1858. It's very clear here. The Crown, the Secretary of the State, the Council of India. Who is the Council of India? See, earlier we had Code of Directors. We had Code of Directors and the Board of Control, isn't it? Now, who are they? The Board of Control are those people who are from the British Crown. The Code of Directors were those people who are the nominees of the British India Company, or those people who are like the trustees of British India Company. Since they were removed completely, they did not had any interference in the Indian administration. Now, as British Crown enjoyed a lot of taxation power, and they also got considerable revenue from the Court of Directors, especially the trustees of the Johns Company, which is the British India Company. So therefore, what they did was, they appointed some of these people into this Council of India. Now, which is merely an advisory body, which can advise about anything to the Secretary of the State. And the Secretary of the State, when he is controlling the entire administration of India, he is responsible to the British Parliament, because he is a cabinet minister. Okay, so if you remember this block diagram, the 1858 Act is done. You need not have to worry about anything. Now, who conducts military civil functions? Governor General. The Governor General from 1858 onwards is called as the Viceroy. This guy is the Viceroy. Who is the Viceroy? The Governor General is the Viceroy. And who conducts the civil operation, who conducts the military operation? Everything, every policy, including the administrative affairs, would be done by the high officials under the counsel of the Governor General. So this is what it is in terms of the Act of 1858. Got it, everybody? Right? Likewise, the Governor is exactly a replica of the Governor General. You also had a council. He also had a council. He also had a group of high officials, and these high officials are responsible to conduct the administrative, legislative, executive, all type of civil affairs under the directions of the governor. Well, these are all the provincial governor. Well, what used to happen? The governor takes the direction from the Governor General. So therefore, the entire administration is bureaucratic. The entire administration was without a popular representation. It was with a imperial control, and Governor General was the kingpin of the entire administration, who was called as the Viceroy. He controlled the entire administration. The Secretary of the State controlled the entire administration with the help of the Governor General. Right? So this was an act of centralization. This is where the British control of Indian administration was seen. This is, in other words, is the Government of India Act of 1858. Okay. So I'm pretty sure that all of you understood this. This is what I've written here. Governor General, Viceroy of India, both Board of Control and Code of Directors cease to exist. Is because you have the Council of India, which is like merely an advisory body. Then you have the Secretary of the State, who is vested with the complete authority of India. And then you have the Council of India and the absolute imperial control. So these are the important points, but you have to remember. Right? Since I have already told you that if you remember this block diagram, then nothing is required. You should remember this. Okay? So next, let's move on to the next important act. The next one is the Indian Councils Act. So what exactly happened in the Indian Councils Act? You should remember the block diagram which I have already written, depending on which there is an addition. For the first time, what they have done is representative institution. So what is a representative institution? Is nothing but in this body, they are creating legislative council. That is all it is. In which body? Sorry. So in the body of high officials, I think you can see this here. That's the Council of the Governor General. They are creating legislative council. So there is an executive council which has existed already. They are creating a legislative council. So this legislative council should comprise of certain people who are not high officials. That is why they are creating. So this is an evolution, basically. This is where Indian should be, right? So this was an attempt, basically, is because Indians started questioning this. After 1858, our, freedom fighters, especially during those time, they started asking, where is the popular participation? Where have you included the Indians? So therefore, it was like an eye washer. What they did was, for the first time, they created this legislature council. And mind you, during this time itself, the Governor General had the power to veto any bill which is made by the Legislature Council here. The Legislature Council for the first time existed from this act, which is the 1860s, the Indian Councils Act. 1861 Indian Councils Act. That's where it started. And the Legislature Council is this council, especially the Legislature Council, but then the power to introduce any legislation is still with the high officials. So even they introduce anything here, any bill here, he has the power to veto. And the governor can also reserve any bill, likewise, which is controlled by the high officials before the Governor General. And he can also veto that. Right? So therefore, those powers, what you saw it in case of the Indian President, or which you are seeing right now with the Indian President, now that was existent during those time with the Governor General in itself. So this is where you will see it, that the Governor General had some of these powers to veto and so on, right? And he also had similar functions what the President has right now with respect to the legislature. You would see this. Okay, next. Okay, apart from that, restoring legislative process to Bombay and Madras. Okay, so you know that the Charter Act and also after that the Government of India Act, it was an act of centralization. So they tried to decentralize this by restoring the powers of Bombay and Madras, the legislative powers of Bombay and Madras. And then it also introduced the term called as portfolio system during this time. What's portfolio system? It's the subject matters to various ministers. Okay. And what are these subject matters? You all know that the portfolio system right now, it is on railways, it is on finance and so on. The British started this portfolio system in the Indian Councils Act in itself. And but then these were provided to only European or British officials. It was not to be given to any Indian. It was still under the hands of a British who, without any popular representation, he was controlling the Indian administration. That's how the British India was controlled. Next, as I said, like how the President of India has the power right now, it was in its evolution during the phase of Indian Councils Act. The Governor General had, who is called as the Viceroy right now, he also has the ordinance making power. What are ordinance? As you all know, ordinance is nothing but the temporary legislation. Now, ordinance is nothing but the temporary legislation, and related to this temporary legislation, you should know that this can be introduced by the Viceroy when the legislature council is not in session, correct? So ordinance, but can be introduced whether the session is there or not. So there is a supremacy of the Viceroy, that's the Governor General, on the Indian legislative system even during that time. So whether the session was there or not, he can still go ahead with the ordinance, right? So it's like an absolute control over the Indian administration and also the Indian legislative process. So this was to be seen by the Viceroy. So these are some of the important things what you see it in case of Indian Councils Act. So what you just saw was a provision here, that is the Legislature Council, and we saw an improvement, an evolution of Legislative Council. That's all we saw in case of the Indian Councils Act of 1861. Okay. Since we have already discussed about the important block diagram of the Government of India Act of 1858, and we also discussed about the Indian Councils Act of 1861. Now let's try to discuss the Indian Councils Act of 1892. Please do understand it is just an evolution. It is a continuing evolution which happened in the case of 1858, which happened in the case of 1861. Now it is continuing in 1892. So what was that? Especially, it increased the non-official members in the central and provincial legislature council. Now where are we discussing this? Through a schematic, since we have already understood what exactly is the council. The council comprises of legislature council right now. So earlier in 1858, what happened? We had only this block diagram, and then we had only the council, right? And in this council, we had legislature council, executive council, and all of that was supposed to be performed by the high officials. Slowly in 1861, there was a separate council called legislature council. Now in 1892, you have a separate council called Indian Legislature Council, which has come up, and also in the provinces you have a provincial legislature council. Now the next question is, who makes the appointment for all of it? So please do understand, it was nominated. In fact, in the case of the legislature council at the center, it was supposed to be nominated by the legislature council from the provinces. So you had a provinces legislature council. So this provinces legislature council is responsible for appointment of, that is nominating the Indian Legislature Council. Simultaneously, there was also universities, right? If you can recall, we had discussed about the Macaulay, right? The Macaulay Committee was responsible for the English education. Well, that Macaulay Committee was also responsible for providing important instructions and recommendations associated to English education. So during that time, when there were more and more of universities, they had a lot of these Senate members. And these members were also responsible to nominate, you know, people in the case of the provincial legislature council. Apart from that, you had the district boards. We had discussed in the acts, the charter acts, that there were a lot of existence of local bodies. The local bodies had members, and these members were also responsible for nomination of people in the provincial legislature council. So basically, the provincial legislature council comprised of nominated members from district boards, also from the local boards. At the same time, they also had nomination from the Indian University. On the other end, the Indian Legislature Council comprised of people who were supposed to be nominated from the Provincial Legislature Council. So in fact, this is where the term called representative institution was started. So it was like an indirect election, right? So though it was a nomination, but then these people had a say in this. So that's where the term called as representative institution is being used. The same thing is being used in Lakshmikant. So what exactly is the representative institution? This is the representative institution. In fact, the provincial legislature council being decided by the district boards, and at the same time you will find that the high officials in the case of the provincial legislature council, the central legislature council, they being nominated from the provincial legislature council. So this is a point here. And slowly in the central legislature council, since there is an Indian legislature council here, these people were assigned with certain responsibility. Now, what is that responsibility? They had the power to discuss budget. They were given certain consideration to make the bill and so on. Now, nevertheless, you should also understand that the powers of the Viceroy, that's the Governor General, which was seen in the case of 1861 Indian Councils Act, continued here. Now, what was that? You should always understand the ordinance making power and also the power of making the bills the power to veto the bill, all of that was provided to that of the Governor General. So even he can veto any bill which was initiated by the Indian Legislature Council, which was submitted to the Governor. And the Governor can definitely place this under the consideration of the Governor General. So these are certain things what you can see with respect to the Indian Councils Act of 1898. So they had the power to discuss budget. The non-official members in the case of the Indian Legislature Council is supposed to be Indians, The non-official members were assigned with certain responsibilities, and slowly the representative institutions started. So these are some of the important points what you have to remember in this case, and that's in the Indian Councils Act. So this is like an evolution. So that's what is mentioned here. It's like an evolution. So they had the power to discuss budget, and then the Central Legislature Council by the Provincial Legislature Council and the Bengal Chamber of Commerce. Oh, what is this Bengal Chamber of Commerce? Now, this was an influential body which was responsible to instruct and influence the Provincial Legislature Council. In fact, Bengal Chamber of Commerce comprised of people from traders and merchants. And these traders and merchants had a very big say in the British East India Company, and also they used to control the Legislature Council indirectly. So therefore, these people had a say in the case of the Provincial Legislature Council. And as I said, the Provincial Legislature Council was supposed to be decided by the district boards, universities, and also municipalities. So these are the important points in the case of the Indian Councils Act of 1892. So moving ahead, one of the major, act which is considered to be the stalking feature in the case of the constitution making in case of India is the Indian Councils Act of 1909, because for the first time it brought an electorate called as communal electorate, which all of you know. What exactly it is, why did this happen, and what happened in the case of the non-official members. So these are certain things. These developments are important for us. First and foremost, the Provincial and the Central Legislature Council had an increase in members. So therefore, the size of the Provincial and Central Legislature Council increased, and with more and more of members. However, we should always understand, since it is centralization, British had an art of controlling the systems in India, that is keeping their responsibility, keeping their authority with them, and diverting every single thing on the Indians. How did they do this was, they increased the official majority in the case of the Central Legislature Council, meaning they kept it the same. The non-official majority was never gone there. So official majority was more in the case of the center, while what happened, the non-official members were increased in the provinces. We all know that the governor directly, reports to that of the Governor General. That's the Viceroy. And therefore, you should also understand that this is an act of centralization. So an act of centralization means that the Governor General of India has a complete control over the Indian administration. So the governor does not have any power, an independent power, to pass any bill. So the Governor General of India can interfere in any part of the bill. So in fact, he can also he can also make an ordinance. He can also pass a contrary ordinance than that of the bill which is placed in the Provincial Legislature Council. So all of these were the question marks. So therefore, what the British did was, they made sure that the official majority was retained at the center. The non-official majority in the provinces was completely, increased, and they kept the non-official majority in the provinces. Just it was like an eye washer for the Indians. The next thing what they did was, they increased the functions of the non-official members, especially in the case of the Central Legislature Council. Now you should understand that there is an existence of Central Legislature Council, also the Provincial Legislature Council. In the case of the Central Legislature Council, you will have official members. In the case of the Provincial Legislature Council, you will have official members. But what is happening in the case of the Central Legislature Council, the non-official members are lesser. The official members are more. While in the case of the Provincial Legislature Council, the non-official members are more, while the official members are less. So this is what has happened, and they have increased the power of asking questions to that of the non-official members in the Central Legislature Council. So these were certain things what happened, and of course, apart from that, the association of Indians with that of the Executive Council increased, and Satyendra Prasad Sinha was one of the first member, and these were done in the case of the Executive Council of Viceroy and also the Governor. So this is at the center, and this is at the provinces. So one of the stalking feature of this act is a separate electorate for the Muslims, and this was seen as one of the negative whys in the system. Well, this went on to create more and more of problems in 1932 and also in 1947 in itself, and it resulted in a lamentable partition of India. So this exposed British idea of dividing Indians, dividing the unity of Indians and creating more and more of chaos in the system, and therefore making sure that the powers was not handed over to the Indians. And the term called as self-government was still a question mark. It's because most of the freedom fighters during this time did question the separate electorate for Muslims. Well, apart from that, separate representation was created in corporations and the Bengal Chamber of Commerce and also universities. So these were some of the important provisions which was created in 1909. Mind you, I'm just keeping only the political developments. I'm not keeping any historical developments here. And what actually happened in 1909 was the direct representation. In fact, they mentioned for a direct representation, so for a direct election. So, well, you should understand that the direct election was never there. In fact, there are a lot of conditions for people who are voting for the first time. Okay, and let's see what was the developments which happened in 1919. Well, this is about the Indian Councils Act. Now, in the block diagram, what we are seeing in the Indian Legislature Council are already expanded within that Indian Legislature Council and the Provincial Legislature Council. So they want to create certain electorates, like how we have constituency that is supposed to be seen. And you should also understand that there is an existence of the term called as parliament, but then which is not called as parliament, it was called as a legislature council. So there is an existence of a central legislature council and there is an existence of provincial legislature council. So this is what we need to understand. So let's move ahead with the most important act. The Government of India Act of 1919 is very, very important for us. The reason why it is very, very important for us is because what we see as a development in the Indian Constitution, what we see as an established institutions in Indian Constitution is based on this act. Of course, the next act is equally important is because many people do say, and it is the reality, that the Indian Constitution is a ditto copy of the Government of India Act of 1935. However, there are certain provisions which we see it in the Parliament, which is still continued till date, which was initiated in 1919. One of the most important starking feature is the presence of bicameral legislature. In fact, the Indian Legislature Council was divided into two houses. One is the upper house and the other one is the lower house. And it was called as the Indian Legislature Council. The lower house was supposed to be directly elected, while the upper house was supposed to be indirectly elected. And out of these two, what is very, very important is the Government of India Act of 1919 very clearly mentioned that both of these legislature will have equal powers, except the power of purse. The bicameral legislature very clearly said that this provision, the Government of India Act of 1919, very clearly created a bicameral legislature with equal powers except the power of purse. So what do you mean by power of purse? The power of purse is nothing but the financial power. Therefore, in the Constitution right now, money bill can be introduced only in Lok Sabha. So it means that the lower house had the financial powers, the upper house did not had any financial powers according to the Government of India Act of 1919. So the same thing is being seen right now in the Parliament. Lok Sabha has the provision where the money bill can be introduced. Okay, and money bill cannot be introduced in Rajya Sabha. Money bill, in Rajya Sabha does not have any power except discussing about the money bill. Right? And where did it all start? It started here. Well, apart from that, both the houses were supposed to be equal. Both the houses were equal. So this is what we see it in case of bicameral legislature. The second thing what we need to understand is the devolution of powers. Now, you should not understand this as a clear division of power. So there is a difference between devolution of power and the division of power. And you should also not understand this as something as federation. Federation is different. Federation is dependent on division of power. It is not dependent on devolution of power. What is devolution of power? Some sort of power is devolved to the subordinate, right? Here the devolution of power meaning is from the central administration to the provincial administration. So therefore the governor had certain powers, you know, to be independent or to encourage them to make certain independent decision making with respect to their provinces. Now, that is what we need to understand as devolution of powers. To give you a practical explanation of this, let's say that you are a DC, right, and you are absent for let's say 15 days or 20 days, right? Now what you do is, since you are absent, what you do is you give certain signing authority to your subordinate and who is an assistant commissioner. Okay, so that's called as delegation of power. Devolution is giving certain powers to your subordinate so that he can act in his own discretion in certain cases but not in all cases. So this is called as devolution of power. So still the complete authority is vested with you, right? You can take it back whenever you feel like, right? It's like you are giving some independence but then the independence is not there. Okay, so anyway, so that's something which we saw it in case of the Government of India Act of 1919. One of the most important feature of Government of India Act of 1919 is diarchy. So what do you mean by diarchy? Diarchy is nothing but dual governance, or also called as, you know, parallel government in some cases. Now you should not misunderstand parallel government here. Diarchy is dual government basically. Now what is that dual government? There were two set of lists which was created. You know, basically the list was supposed to be divided into two. One is called as the central list. The other one is called as the provincial list. So in the provinces, again the list was divided into two. One is called as the reserved, the other one is called as transferred. Now what is interesting here is the transferred subjects were supposed to be governed by the governor along with that of the ministers. Why ministers here? Ministers are non-official members. Now the Indian Legislature Council is already operative, so you also have the Provincial Legislature Council. The reserved subjects was along with the governor plus the high officials. This is why it is called as, oh my goodness, sorry. This is why it is called as dual government. I hope all of you are understanding this. Lists are nothing but subject matters. You know, you had agriculture, you had water, you had education, so on and so forth. So the list gets divided into two. Please do understand, the British always kept the most important list with them, which are called as the central list. Something which is responsible for the development of India was kept as the provincial list. Agriculture, education, water, etc. Also irrigation and so on. So the provincial list, okay, what were the important subjects which they kept? Defense, finance, then related to insurance, related to banking, which we also see today, and they also kept one important subject called as ecclesiastical affairs. Ecclesiastical affairs is to do with the church, all right. So all of these were central list, and there were certain provincial list. Again, under the provincial list, they were transferred and reserved. Okay. Reserved subjects were to do with the police, law and order, etc. Transferred subjects were for the building blocks of the society, like agriculture again, and education. So all of these were kept under the transferred subject. So please do understand, this type of government is called as diarchy. So there is a governor is along with the high officials will decide on the reserved subject. Governor along with the ministers will decide on the transferred subject. This is what it is. This type of governance is called as diarchy, which is called as the dual government. In fact, the provinces were to have diarchy. Diarchy was introduced in the provinces. So, well, apart from that, 3 out of the 6 in the Viceroy's Executive Council shall be Indian. This was one thing which was made mandatory. And of course, the separate electorate was increased, and it was expanded to that of 6, and also Indian Christians along with that of Anglo-Indians. So this was also another important thing which they did it. One of the other important thing what they did was the setup and the establishment of public service commissions. So the public service commissions were set up during this time, and that was in the Government of India Act of 1919. And for the first time, the term called as budgets, especially for the provincial, and also a separate budget for the central administration was introduced. So these were some of the important features of the Government of India Act of 1919. This is a very, very important act, is basically because this act was implemented till 1947. In fact, the Government of India Act of 1935 was never implemented. I repeat this point. The Government of India Act of 1919 was in execution till 1947. Never ever the government implemented the Government of India Act of 1935. Why? Is because of the developments which happened during those times. So this is what we need to remember. Well, this act resulted in a lot of criticism, especially from our father of our nation, Mahatma Gandhi ji, who had coined the term called as watertight compartments. The reason why he said watertight compartment is because the devolution of powers were never there. The independence for the governor was never there. Right? And even if you see the diarchy here, where you have the transferred and the reserved subjects, finance was a reserved subject, and let's say agriculture was a transferred subject. And if the ministers wanted the agricultural development, they need money. And who decides on the money? The high official will decide on the money. Now, why will the high official give it to the ministers was the question. There's always a friction between the ministers and the high officials. And one more thing is, all these high officials, they held their office during the pleasure of the Secretary of the State and the Governor General. So they never listened to the ministers here. So therefore, the ministers could not take any action against these high officials. So all of these were certain criticism which happened during the Government of India Act of 1919. So this is what you need to remember. So moving ahead, so the development is very clear. We are talking about the Indian Legislature Council now, which is becoming more pronounced and pronounced as and when we are moving towards a different act. So each act is like an evolution. Okay, so let's move on with the next act. So the next one is the Government of India Act of 1935, right? So they abolished, diarchy, and diarchy was introduced at the center, and diarchy was abolished in the provinces. So therefore, they introduced something called as provincial autonomy. For the first time, the term called as federation was being used in this act, and India were to have an all India federation. Now, please do understand, all India federation was compulsory for the provinces. It was compulsory, but it was optional for the princely states. For princely states, it was just optional, So this is what we need to understand. So we had an all India federation, and this all India federation comprised of both provinces as well as princely states. And this all India federation was compulsory for the provinces, while it was optional for all of the princely states. Now, of course, they abolished the diarchy at the provinces. They introduced provincial autonomy, and instead they used diarchy at the center. And the bicameralism, the process of two legislature, was also used in the provinces. We saw it in the Indian legislature, bicameral Indian legislature. Now it was expanded to all of the provinces as well. And it resulted in communal representation to the depressed classes. So a separate electorate for the depressed classes was also announced, which was, of course, resulted in a lot of political developments and conflicts and so on. Well, the term called as Council of India. So what is Council of India? We had discussed that in the block diagram, if you all remember. Now, this Council of India was completely abolished in 1935 because it was acting like an advisory body, and this advisory body was given to the Secretary of State. So this was a body which was supposed to provide some sort of responsibility to that of the nominees of Court of Directors and the Board of Control, or rather those members of Court of Directors and Board of Control, which the British thought they should not be abandoned. and they were also unhappy. So they were dissatisfied basically because this post was completely removed from the British. So they were pacified through Council of India, but in the Government of India Act, it was an attempt to create own self-governance. So therefore, this body was completely abolished. Right. Apart from that, you will see every single thing what you see in the Constitution right now. In fact, it resulted in establishment of a federal court and also a Federal Public Service Commission, and also a provision was made for the Joint Public Service Commission in 1935. In fact, you can also add about the Auditor General. It also provided for an Auditor General, who is right now called as the Comptroller and Auditor General. The Government of India Act provided for an Auditor General to do the audit and also for the maintenance of the accounts. So these were some of the important features of the Government of India Act of 1935. What we need to remember here is the bicameralism in the provinces and an All India Federation. These two are the most important features here. And one more thing here is this act continued to be the foundation stone for the Constitution of India. So therefore, it's always believed that without the borrowed feature, if you find certain original terms in the case of the Constitution of India, these were the ditto copy of the Government of India Act of 1935. Okay. Of course, as I said, the critic of this act was never implemented. The old Government of India Act of 1919. It went on till 1947. So the next important act is the Government of India Act of 1947, or also called as the Indian Independence Act. As the name itself suggests, that India and Pakistan was declared as an independent sovereign state. The term called as sovereign is very, very important for us, is basically because the term called as sovereign refers to independent authority. It's nothing but the independent authority of the state. This is a definition for sovereign, right? While this act also mentioned that India and Pakistan were getting dominion status. They were considered to be dominions. Now, what do you mean by dominion? Dominion are independent states, but still owe an allegiance to the crown. Now, what do you mean by that? They owe an allegiance or allegiance, whichever your pronunciation, to the crown. Now, what is this owing an allegiance to the crown? It's nothing like, let's say that, Canada once upon a time was a British colony, all right. And it so happens that whenever the Britain makes a law or Britain gives any kind of policy for international cooperation and so on, they acknowledge that. They follow the same policy which is given by the Britain. So that's kind of owing an allegiance to the crown. In fact, some of the states right now, some of the countries right now, they want to, completely remove that. But most, in fact, the Government of India Act of 1947, also called as the Indian Independence Act, gave the stature called as dominion status. So India and Pakistan was considered to be the dominant states during that time, though it was independent. But what we did was through our preamble, and once we finished our constitution, when it was given and enacted to the people of this country, we declared that we are completely sovereign and independent. And that's when we shelled away our term called as dominion status. While Pakistan continued to have the dominion status till 1956. That is what you see. Well, of course, this created two important states, and one is India and Pakistan. And all of the important offices which was created by the British, like that of the Governor General or the Viceroy, the Governor, all of that was abolished. Now, the Viceroy becomes the President. That's the Governor General, he becomes the President, and while the Governor continues to be the Governor of various states. So this becomes a constitutional head. Right, while this becomes the constitutional head of the state, while it was a creation of one more important office, and that was the Prime Minister. And it also created the Constituent Assembly to adopt and frame the constitution, and it was supposed to provide all important features for the constitutional authority, right? And it also made sure that the princely states were given proper freedom, and this freedom was to make sure that they can either join with India or Pakistan. So these are some of the important features of Indian Independence Act. So this part of it, this topic here, right, which covers two important things. The first important things are the Charter Act. The Charter Act from Regulating Act till the Charter Act of 1853. The second important thing is the Government of India Act of 1858 till that of the Indian Independence Act of 1947. Out of these two, you have to give highest importance to that of the Indian Independence Act, the Government of India Act of 1858 till that of 1947 instead of the Charter Act, is because in the past 6 to 7 years, you've never seen any question from these areas. However, you have seen certain statements from some of these acts in one of the question, one or the other question, but then you'll not get beyond 1 or 2 marks from this. Why I say this is especially one question, right? But then I would always say that you should not just neglect this. Just go through them, and I've made an attempt to put all of them on the slide. The most important points, I've put all of them in the slides, and I hope the slides should help you, is because these are some of the important summaries. And wherever the slides, the principles or the features are absent, I've made sure that I've explained that on the whiteboard here. So I hope you take the cognizance of all of this. Okay. Well, the next topic is about the salient features of the Indian Constitution, and Indian Constitution being the bag of borrowed materials. Well, let's try to understand certain terminologies also here. Well, from UK, we have borrowed certain features. Which are the features which we have borrowed? The first one, of course, the Westminster model, also called as the parliamentary system of democracy. We have already discussed what is parliamentary system of democracy, which is always dependent on the ministerial responsibility, and one of the important features is the existence of the cabinet system. Rule of law. Rule of law is very clear. It means it specifies certain rules which is made for establishment of the law. And rule of law also says that nobody is above or below the law. In other words, this is equivalent to the concept of Dhamma. And that is why we always have this important, pillar strength, and that's called as truth alone triumphs. Okay. So, well, rule of law is a concept which speaks about providing equality before each and every single person, irrespective of the gender, irrespective of the caste or the creed or religion, etc. The next one is a single citizenship, and we all know that this is a unitary feature. Of course, we have taken this from United Kingdom, and the cabinet form of the government, where it provides the Prime Minister at the vital post and the other ministers, and you have different hierarchy of ministers there, starting with that of the cabinet and the cabinet minister, the person who meets the Prime Minister and also attends the cabinet meeting regularly. Apart from that, you have the ministers of state. Apart from that, you also have the Minister of State holding an independent charge, and then the Deputy Minister. And then the concept of prerogative writs. What are writs? Writs are nothing but the orders which are issued by the Supreme Court, especially, or the High Court, especially if any citizen's abrogation of fundamental rights happen. Now, if any citizen's exploitation of rights do happen, in that situation, the Supreme Court, the Honorable Supreme Court or the High Court, they issue a prerogative writs. Writs are a form of grievance redressal mechanism to any citizen who faces the violation of his fundamental rights. So that's where the writs come in. The next one is the bicameralism, and you all know that we have 2 houses in the legislature. We have one of the biggest advantages in case of bicameralism, and what is that advantage? Each house acts like a reasonable check and balance on the other. Like, for example, Rajya Sabha in case of India, it can definitely provide certain methodology to assess the bills which are passed by the Lok Sabha, and the Lok Sabha can do the same thing. It's vice versa. So therefore, these are some of the important things what we have taken it from Britain. Moving ahead, from United States of America, the impeachment procedure of the president. We'll be trying to understand about the impeachment procedure of the president. Now, impeachment is a word which is used to remove the constitutional authority. In case of Indian Constitution, it is being used in the case of the president, also in the case of the Supreme Court or the High Court judges. The concept of fundamental rights, the most important rights, there are different types of rights. Fundamental rights are the most important rights which are always justiciable. So that's why they are called as fundamental rights. It helps in decent standard of living for any individual who is considered to be the citizens of that country. So each and every constitution provides the most important rights to them, to him, especially because he is a citizen of that country. The removal of Supreme Court and the High Court judges, that's also taken from United States of America. The concept of judicial review. Now, what is judicial review? It's an act of judiciary to check whether the rule made by the legislature or the executive is within the boundary of the Constitution. Supposing it is not, in that case, the Supreme Court has every right to cancel those rule or a law to make sure that it comes within the boundary of the Constitution. Right? There are many examples to say that, but then this judicial review will not happen through suo motu. One of or any citizen of this country or anybody has to question that before the High Court or the Supreme Court, and that's where the judicial review shall happen. All laws which are passed by the government with the help of the parliament, now they are always subjective to that of the judicial review. Next, the preamble. Preamble is a foreword of the Indian Constitution, and this is taken from United States of America. Preamble provides some of the important features and the objectives and what it wants to attain, and it's a gist of the entire Constitution. Like any book has got a foreword, like for a constitution, the preamble is the foreword. Well, independence of judiciary. So what do you mean by independence of judiciary? Judiciary is not part of the legislature, neither part of the executive. It's completely independent. Why it is independent? In order to support the rights of the citizen and to make sure that each and every organ works according to the Constitution. Well, all the functions of the Vice President, including, most importantly, that he functions as the chairman of Rajya Sabha, that's the chairman of the upper house, that is being taken from United States of America. Moving ahead. So from Canada, we've taken that federation with a strong center, and that is why it is called as the Canadian model of federation. The residuary power to the center is basically because the center is powerful. Appointment of the governor and also the disallowance of the legislature, the state legislature, that is state legislative assembly bills. Disallowance of state legislative assembly bills is again taken from Canada. The appointment of the governor, the state governors, that's also taken from Canada. And advisory jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. So what's advisory jurisdiction? Supreme Court has three jurisdictions, as you all know. The first one is original, the second one is appellate, the third one is advisory, where the Supreme Court can seek advice from the President. Now, what sort of advice given by the President? That's not binding on the Supreme Court. So this is where the advisory jurisdiction of the Supreme Court is seen, and this feature is taken from Canada. Next, Australia, we have taken concurrent list. Concurrent list is a list where both the state as well as the center has equal power to make laws on them, since the center is powerful. So normally what happens in case of a federation? Supposing if the state has already made a law on a subject, the center should not make it. Or the center has made a law on the subject, the state should not make it. However, in case of India, there is constant friction in this area, and that is why you need a Supreme Court to interfere here. But in concurrent list, if there is a subject, both can make a law on it. Like for example, there is a national education policy right now on education, while the state argue that they can also make a law on the state, the law on the education, because it falls under the concurrent list. So in concurrent list, both of them can make a law, and this is taken from Australia. Freedom of trade and commerce, there are certain provisions which is given in the Indian Constitution related to trade and commerce, and that's being taken from Australia. From the French Constitution, we have taken the term called as republic. So what is republic? We have already discussed. Republic is there is no hereditariness, there is no monarchical setup. The head of the state is always elected. In the case of India, it's the president, so he is always elected. So that's called as a republic, and I have already told you that republic does not have any synonymous with that of democracy. Democracy is different, republic is different. Next is equality, liberty and fraternity. We see that in preamble also. Equality is to give equal opportunities to each and every fellow Indians. Supposing if he is an Indian citizen, then he shall be given an equal opportunity. So that's where sometimes whenever there are certain developments in this country, equality is one question, which is always objected to, which is always, lingers in the mind of many people who are academicians, including me, that whether we are subjecting each and every person into equal terms. Well, the second one is liberty. Liberty is nothing but the freedom. Again, we see that in our fundamental rights, also in the preamble. Fraternity is the universal brotherhood, right? Irrespective of whichever caste or religion we belong to, we should never forget that we are Indians. And that's what the Constitution has already said. So these things we have taken it from France. Certain things which we have taken it from other constitution, before we go ahead with these kind of salient features. From Russia, we have taken fundamental duties. Fundamental duties are taken from Russia. This is what we need to remember. And we have also taken the amendment procedure from South Africa. that we should never forget. So amendment procedure is taken from South Africa. Then emergency provision. Related to emergency and emergency provisions, we have taken that feature from Weimar Constitution of Germany. These are certain other things which we have taken it from different countries. Well, the other salient features what we have in our constitution is including fundamental rights, duties which we are going to discuss, directive principles of state policy, independent and integrated judiciary, judicial review and judicial activism. We're going to discuss this a bit later in the next session, of course, on all of these things. Well, moving ahead, let's discuss about the very first important thing, and that's the preamble. Okay, so what does the preamble starts with? The preamble starts with, we the people of India having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic. So therefore, there are two things what we need to understand. They are divided into principles and objectives. What is divided into principles and objectives? Preamble. Now, which are those principles? Sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic are these principles. Which are the objectives? The objectives are given as justice, liberty, equality, fraternity and integrity. So this is what we need to understand with respect to our preamble. Well, before we understand about the significance of the preamble, let's try to understand the prelude behind it, right? Preamble is always based on an objectives resolution which was initiated by Jawaharlal Nehru. Now this objectives resolution contained all these important things, which is nothing but the gist of the constitution. Now, the very first word here is, now, we the people of India refers to the people of this country. It does not refer to the parliamentarians. It does not refer to that of the members of parliament. While the very first word is sovereign, is because we were subjugated under the hands of British for more than 250 years. So therefore, India gives highest importance to sovereign. What is sovereign? The land of India is independent. The government of India is independent. The people of this country are independent and free. And therefore, the definition of sovereign is independent authority of the state. We are free to have our own government. There is nobody above us to dictate us. So that's what it means. So it's very clearly the very first principles of the Indian Constitution. What is socialism here? Socialism has two important meanings. The first meaning is owning of the most important enterprises for development by the government. Okay, so this is the first meaning. While of course the term called as socialist and secular, these were introduced in 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act 1976. The original preamble had only sovereign, democratic and republic. Now this is where a lot of these political conflict, where the ruling party was saying that we might, some of the members, of course not a prime minister, some of the members were saying that there might be a change of socialist and secular because this was an added version in 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act in 1976. So nevertheless, but then it's there in the preamble. What we need to understand is these are parts of the preamble until and unless they're removed through a constitutional amendment or otherwise if the Supreme Court creates a different interpretation to all of this. Well, so sovereign is independent authority of the state. Socialist is where I said there are two meanings. The first meaning is owning of the most important enterprises by the government for development. The second important meaning is to distribute the resources equitably to each and everybody. Right? So this is a second meaning of socialism, where it gives highest importance to that of the peasant class and the labor class. Now, the socialism concept is a concept which is taken from Russia. Right, and the reason why this was vehemently being used in case of India is basically because of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi. Jawaharlal Nehru was the last advocatee of the Socialist Democrats, and in fact he was also one of the thinker and advocacy group of London School of Economics and London School of Politics. So therefore he used the second 5-year plan. which is also called as Mahalanobis Nehru Plan of Development. And socialism was being used where there was existent interference of the state to improve a lot of things. So, the next government, Indira Gandhi's government wanted to give importance to that, recognition of the constitution to that. So, therefore, it was introduced. We'll come to the point whether you can amend the constitution and so on. We'll take the discussions a bit later about some of the important cases. And one of the cases which we are going to discuss, of course, is the Keshwananda Bharati case. And we'll also discuss the Golaknath case and the Berubari case and what happened in the LIC case. Now, because all of these 4 cases are very, very important for your examination. And of course, last year it was, the Keshwananda Bharati. He passed away in 2023. So we expected a question on preamble, but then it was not asked, especially on Keshwananda Bharati case. Even today, this case provides a lot of thought-provoking, discussions whenever the case is discussed by the academicians, is because there are different angles and dimensions in which this case is being interpreted. Of course, we have to take the honorable judgment given by the Honorable Supreme Court. Well, next is secular. Secular has 3 meanings. The first meaning is the state shall not endorse any religion. This is the first meaning. Of course, this was also introduced in the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act. The second meaning is all religions are supposed to be treated equally. This is the second meaning. Okay. The third meaning is non-interference in the religious affairs of any individual. These are the 3 meanings what we say as secular. In fact, the most important meaning is the state shall not endorse any religion. Meaning the state, that's the government, shall not tell to any citizen of this country that we belong to this sort of a religion. So that's called as secular. Right? So, I will not take any debates here. Please do understand we are just covering a rapid revision. We are just trying to find out the meanings and some of the important concepts, helping you to revise the topics as many times as possible. Well, the next important, and there are 2 types of it. Okay, there was also a discussion about this. There are 2 types of secularism there. One is called as the soft secularism and the hard secularism. What kind of a state India is? India is a soft secular state than that of the hard secular state. Hard secular state is France. So I'll give you an example of this. In fact, in the case of France, there was a rule which was made by the French government that each and every person is supposed to be treated equally. So therefore, whatever the state gives as an instruction, that has to be followed irrespective of any religion. Right? Whether you are a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu or you are a Sikh, you are supposed to follow the same thing. There cannot be given an exception to it. While when this happened, there were certain schools where they were, giving breakfast to the school children. In fact, they were also giving breakfast in the form of, they were serving pork and beef and every single thing. So it so happens that in one of the school, that they served pork to the children, and some of the children complained that it hurt their religious feelings because in their religion they cannot consume pork. So in fact the parents complained this to the school, and then the school authorities brought it to the notice of the nearby administrative authority, and the school authorities were very clear that since France is not a soft secular state, therefore, if their parents were affected by it, they had to pack a lunch or the breakfast for the school children. While if this were to happen in case of India, then it affects India secularism, is because India secularism is a soft secular state. It's not a hard secular state. So therefore, France is a hard secular, India is a soft secular state. Next, democracy, we have discussed that in detail. Please do understand. And what type of democracy we are following? It's the parliamentary system of democracy. And we also have certain tools here, right? We had 4 tools of direct democracy, out of which we follow right to recall. We also follow initiative. We have not followed plebiscite. We have not followed referendum. We had referendums couple of times, but then the Honorable Supreme Court in 2023 has very clearly said that referendum is not part of the Indian Constitution. So therefore, that ends the judgment there. So republic, we have already discussed about the meaning of republic. Next, let's move ahead with the objectives. What are the objectives here? The very first objective is justice. So because it says justice of social, economic and political. So the very first justice is a social justice. Examples of social justice is reservation. And you should also understand the reservation is not an it is an exception. In case of equality, you should not understand that it goes against equality in India. Okay. Liberty means freedom. and you find that right to freedom, which is very clearly seen in the case of the fundamental rights. Where do you see the justice of social, economic and political? You see all of this in DPSP, Directive Principles of State Policy. Now we are trying to get a connectivity from that of the preamble to other features of the Indian Constitution. So if you were to speak about justice, liberty, so we are talking about justice, social, economic and political. This helps in the concept of welfare state. It helps in the development of a welfare state, which is supposed to be seen in the case of Directive Principles of State Policy, which is not justiciable. Okay. Next, talking about liberty. Liberty means freedom, and this is explicitly seen in case of fundamental rights. Now that's where you have the right to freedom. Next is equality. Of course, you have the equality. That's the very first important right. That's right to equality from 14 to 18. And this is again very clearly seen in the case of the fundamental rights. Fraternity, which means that, giving the concept of universal brotherhood, especially the Indian brotherhood, that is to say that irrespective of whichever religion or a caste or a creed which we belong to, we should never forget that we are Indians. Now, this sort of feeling is seen in case of fundamental duties, where we have 11 fundamental duties, where one of the fundamental duties always say that we have to promote the Constitution and respect the noble ideals of the Constitution. So fraternity is one such, which is normally seen there. Integrity is again that unity and the concept of oneness which we have, and again this is to be seen in case of our fundamental duties and directive principles of state policy. All right, we see all of this in various parts of the Indian Constitution. All right, so that's where justice, liberty, equality, fraternity and integrity is to be seen. Where do we find integrity in DPSP? Wherever we have the commonness, to support the welfare of others. So that is where integrity comes in. So therefore it forms under directive principles of state policy. Next, moving ahead, what are the significance of the preamble? So before we go ahead with these three important things, now you should understand the preamble is non-enforceable. Now, what do you mean by non-enforceable? You cannot approach a Supreme Court and ask the Supreme Court to implement the preamble immediately. So that cannot happen. This is very, very important. It's non-enforceable part of the Indian Constitution. This is very, very important. The next one is preamble provides a clarity to the features of Indian Constitution. So especially it tries to interpret the ambiguous part of the Indian Constitution. So it eliminates the ambiguity. So wherever there is ambiguity, it tries to eliminate the ambiguity. And it also helps in providing the Supreme Court can interpret the Constitution using the preamble. Using the preamble. So this is where the Supreme Court uses it. And as I said, non-enforceable. So preamble provides all important features which are provided in the Constitution. Now, the next important thing, what we need to understand about the preamble is, can you amend the preamble? Right? Can you enrich it? Can you change it? That is where these three important things comes into. The very first case is the Berubari case. I'll give you a short gist of this case. I can't do it in detail. Normally in classrooms, we do it in detail. We go almost for 25 to 30 minutes for each case. Okay, so the background is very simple, that there was an agreement between Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and also Noon. And Noon was the president of Pakistan during that time. So the agreement is called as the Nehru-Noon Pact. And this was on one of the territory in West Bengal. It's called as Berubari. Well, Article 1 of the Indian Constitution, Article 2 of the Indian Constitution, Article 3 of the Indian Constitution is very clear. The Article 1 of the Indian Constitution speaks about Union of India. 2 and 3 speaks about the states and the union territories. Especially article number 3 provides for the concept of creation of the state, diminishing an area of the state. It never provides, or increase the area of the state, it never provides any provision for ceding a territory of Indian territory to a foreign territory. I repeat, there is no provision of ceding Indian territory to a foreign territory. Now, well, according to the Noon and Noon-Nehru agreement, this portion of territory, that's Berubari, was supposed to be provided to Pakistan, you know. And since it was supposed to be provided to Pakistan, we did not had any provision as such in the Indian constitution which can clearly provide this to Pakistan, as in any territory which can be ceded to a foreign territory. So therefore, it was through a constitutional amendment. It was supposed to be through a constitutional amendment. So initially in the Berubari case, what the Supreme Court did was, it went into the preamble of the Indian Constitution, and it very clearly said that the preamble of the Indian Constitution, that's the preamble, is not the part of the Indian Constitution. Therefore, you cannot amend the preamble. So the amendment, why am I talking about this, is because the Supreme Court of India, the Honorable Supreme Court of India, whenever it has to interpret the Constitution, what it does is, it first looks into the preamble. So when it looked into the preamble, it saw that preamble is never a part of the Indian Constitution. So therefore, since it is not enforceable, so therefore, it's never a part of the Indian Constitution. So you cannot amend the Constitution. Well, the next case was the Keshwananda Bharati. So what is the outcome of this Berubari case? Berubari case was between Noon and Nehru agreement, where the question was, was to cede an Indian territory to a foreign territory, wherein the question of interpretation came in, and then that's when the Supreme Court has to look into the preamble also, and finally had to decide that preamble is not the integral part of the Indian Constitution, and therefore you cannot amend the preamble at all, and preamble is non-amendable part of the Indian Constitution. This was declared. Next was the Keshwananda Bharati case. To understand Keshwananda Bharati case, you should understand Golaknath case. And the Golaknath case was in 1967. See, there was always a constant friction between judiciary and the executive during those times. In fact, the parliament, the parliament wanted to encroach most of the powers. There are a lot of interpretation which went on. In fact, it wanted to amend the fundamental rights as well. In Golaknath case, the judgment, the Honorable Supreme Court gave a judgment saying that the Parliament cannot amend the fundamental rights of the Indian Constitution. So you can amend anything, but then you cannot amend the fundamental rights of the Indian Constitution. So this was one of the judgment, historical judgment, which happened in the case of the Golaknath case. So well, in order to counter the Golaknath case, what the government of India did was, it passed 24th and 25th Constitutional Amendment Act. Now these acts, first of all, the 24th Constitutional Amendment Act was to make sure that the Parliament can make amendment to any part of the Indian Constitution. 25th Constitutional Amendment Act was to make sure that the Parliament can encroach on any type of, curtail any type of fundamental rights, that's on the right to public property. It can curtail the fundamental right of public property. I mean, any person having a property, because we had Article 31 and that was abolished in 44th Constitutional Amendment Act, right to property. So 25th Constitutional Amendment Act wanted to curtail the power of procuring a property. And then, the government can take this property and then provide a compensation. And it also mentioned that the act was done in order to justify directive principles of state policy of Article 39 B and C. Well, in the process, the government also argued that the Supreme Court cannot interfere here. There is no judicial review. Okay. So basically, in all of this, the Keshwananda Bharati versus the state of Kerala, this came into. what happened was Keshavananda Bharati had a religious institution, and he was maintaining this religious institution. In order to have social justice all around, since 24th and 25th Constitutional Amendment Act has given a power by the government to all of these state governments also to take away the properties and then give compensation to them, and then the same properties can be distributed to everybody. So it so happens that Keshavananda Bharati had a lot of these religious institutions and properties. The state of Kerala had taken this, and the judgment, in the justification which was given by the state of Kerala, the Kerala government, was it was taken in order to provide social justice to everybody. Their intention was taking away property from rich people and then distributing the land to those people who are have-nots, basically. Keshavananda Bharati saw that this was an attempt of encroaching the right to property, right? And also he questioned this on interference of the religion, right to freedom of religion, right? So therefore, in Keshavananda Bharati case, all of these were brought into. That is on Golaknath case, reversal by the government of India using 24th Constitutional Amendment Act and curtailing the power of procuring property and giving compensation to the people and taking away the property, including harmonious balance to that of directive principles of state policy, providing social justice, and making the Supreme Court void on judicial review. All of that was taken into consideration in Keshavananda Bharati case. In this, though the Honorable Supreme Court upheld 24th and 25th Constitutional Amendment Act, it very clearly brought in a new doctrine called as basic structure of the Indian Constitution. And it said that the government can amend, the Parliament can amend any part of the Indian Constitution except the basic structure of the Indian Constitution, right? And the same thing was reiterated in LIC case, where it said the preamble is an integral part of the Indian Constitution. Therefore, it can be amended, but not the basic structure of the Indian Constitution. Now the question is, can you amend the preamble? You can amend the preamble. You can change the preamble, but there are certain features in the preamble you cannot change it. For example, so they did not define what is basic structure of the Indian Constitution. This is what we have to understand. In the Keshavananda Bharati case, the Honorable Supreme Court did not define what is the basic structure of the Indian Constitution or what is the basic doctrine of the Indian Constitution. It only said which are those features which fall under the basic structure of the Indian Constitution. So if you are asking, the term called as basic structure, is it present in the Indian Constitution? No, it is not present. It is based on the verdict of the Honorable Supreme Court, and that is in the Keshavananda Bharati case. Okay. Now, what exactly do we mean by it? Secularism, does it fall under the basic structure of the Indian Constitution based on the judgment of the Supreme Court? Yes. Fundamental rights, the harmonious balance between the fundamental rights and the directive principles of the state policy, do that fall under the basic structure of the Indian Constitution? Yes. The separation of powers? Yes. Federalism? Yes. Indian federalism? Yes. Independence of judiciary? Recently, they also introduced, that is what I said, in 2023, the last part of 2023, I think, yes, is in the last part of the 2023, they also said that the district judiciary will also fall under the independence of district judiciary. They also fall under the basic structure of the Indian Constitution. So in these cases, it cannot be changed or amended using Article 368. So basically, there is no amendment for the basic structure of the Indian Constitution, right? So the parliamentary system of democracy, that's also considered to be the basic structure of the Indian Constitution. Based on the Supreme Court judgment, we have some of these features which fall under the basic structure. Well, this is about the preamble, and this is what you need to remember about the Keshavananda Bharati case. and also the 24th Constitutional Amendment Act, the 25th Constitutional Amendment Act, and also the Golaknath case. Sorry, I am not able to discuss this in detail. I have given you some of the important points because it's a rapid revision series. Let's go to the next topic, and the next topic is Union and its territories. Let's go ahead with the very first article, and that's Article 1. Article 1 very clearly says that India, that's Bharat, is termed as Union of States. So India and Bharat are two names what we need to understand, and in fact there was a lot of controversy related to it. The Constitution of India is very clear on this, and the term of India and Bharat is very clearly mentioned, and it's mentioned as Union of States. Nowhere we have used the term called as Federal of States. It's always mentioned as Union of States. Now, there are two important things as an expression which we need to understand. The first expression is the Union of India. The second expression is the Territory of India. So, whenever we speak about the Union of India, it's about those states which distributes the federal distribution of power or the federal division of power with the center. So we speak about those 28 states. So that comes across as the Union of India. So the expression Union of India refers to those states which share the division of power with the center. While the term called as Territory of India comprises of all the 28 states plus the 8 union territories which we see it right now. So earlier we had 7 union territories, it was 9 union territories, right now we have 8 union territories, right? So the name of states and union territories, that's Union of India, and the Territory of India refers to, one is the states which share the federal distribution of power with that of the center, while the other expression speaks about the 28 states and also the 7 union territories which forms into the Territory of India. While apart from that, there are certain states which enjoy certain special provisions, and all these special provisions are applicable according to the Constitution of India, and these special provisions are given in Article 371 of the Indian Constitution. 370 is about the Jammu and Kashmir, while 371 is related to the special provisions provided to various states of India. So let's try to understand certain important features which are given in the Constitution related to the creation of states and the union territories. Article number 2 speaks very clearly about the Parliament's power to admit into India and to establish new states here. Now regarding this, we need to speak about the state of Sikkim. So we need to know about the state of Sikkim. Now, in fact, about the state of Sikkim, we should understand that there was a constitutional amendment related to it. That's the 35th Constitutional Amendment. The 35th Constitutional Amendment of Sikkim speaks about Sikkim becoming a state of India. Well, Sikkim was a princely state earlier. It did not sign, initially it had signed an international treaty called as Protectorate. Protectorate is an international agreement between protector and the protectorate to protect the protector. It looks funny, but then that's how it is. Protectorate is an international agreement which is signed between the protector and the protectorate, where the former, that's the protector, had an agreement to protect the protectorate in the event of a danger. So the protector was India and the protectorate was Sikkim. So it so happened that, when princely state was formed, many of these princely states, in fact, Sikkim was ruled by a person called as Chogyal, who had an antecedent of China. In fact, he comes from the Chamber of Princes, which has its antecedent in Tibet, this part of China right now. Well, it so happens that he did not want to join with China, is basically because you all know that it's communist state. In communism, there is no question of monarchy. Do we have? No, definitely not. Because communism speaks about social justice to all. We have already discussed about it. Well, in case of India, India is a democratic country. So therefore, he thought at least if he makes an agreement with India, he can live peacefully and then he can have his own independent power and he can also enjoy that authority over the people. So therefore, he signs this agreement called as protectorate, according to which India gets authority over three important subject matters. The very first one is, of course, the defense. That is the defense of Sikkim. So India can also station its army, its permanent army in Sikkim. And the second one is related to its foreign affairs. That's also the external affairs. So related to foreign affairs, India will have a control. So Sikkim's government should consult, in consultation with the Indian government, shall disclose any information to other country or anything which is like a treaty that's based on the authentication by the Indian government. So that's where the foreign affairs was kept under the control of India. Number 3 is on the communication. So well, these are the three subjects which India had an authority, well, according to this international agreement. It so happens that the people of Sikkim started coming out with their own referendum. Now, through this referendum, they started saying that they had a wish to join with India. Now, this referendum was also passed in the state legislative assembly. Of course, Chogyal opposed all of this. He started blaming India that India is playing politics and it's trying to take over Sikkim. Right? But India did not do it because the Indian government did not do it. It's the people of Sikkim who thought that they'll be better off if they join with India. So after the referendum, after passing a resolution in the state legislative assembly, and also after passing a referendum, now majority of them wished that they expressed their interest to be a part of India and becoming an Indian citizen. So therefore, through this referendum, they overthrow Chogyal and through the state legislative assembly, they passed a resolution to join with that of India. So taking this as an advantage, India provided a constitutional amendment and made sure that Sikkim becomes a part of India. In between, there were a lot of other things which happened, but we do not have time to discuss that. But in fact, Sikkim initially was not a complete state. It was not given the complete statehood by the Indian government. In fact, they gave them a status called as associate state tag. Never ever this was given to any other state except Sikkim, associate state. This was a status given to Sikkim. However, later, when it was vehemently criticized by various sections of the media, that's when the Indian government and the parliament passed on the Constitutional Amendment Act and abolished this associate state tag on Sikkim and gave them the complete, state status to that of Sikkim. Now, this is an example to understand that Sikkim came to India through a constitutional amendment. However, within India, if a state has to be divided, or if one state needs to get an increase in the area, or if it has to diminish the area, or if it wants to alter the boundaries, or if it has to alter the name of the state, all of that come under the purview of the Parliament of India. So, the Parliament of India, under Article number 3, it has every right to create new state by separation of territory from any of the state, right, or increase the area of the state. So we have done, this subclause 1. That's in the case of Chhattisgarh. That's also in the case of Telangana. Increase the area of the state. Parliament has every right to increase the area of any state. It can diminish the area of any state. It can also alter the boundaries of any state. Like there is a huge cry about Nagalim by Nagaland. Nagaland wants to is pressurizing the Indian government that it passes a law which can redraw the boundaries of the northeastern states and create a separate autonomous state to that of Nagaland and calling that as Nagalim. So it can alter the boundaries of the state, but then creating an autonomous state goes against the sovereignty of India, and that's why the Indian government has not done it, and that goes against the purview of the Indian Parliament. So that's where it goes completely against the Constitution also. So altering the boundaries of the state, it can also alter the boundaries of state. For example, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Telangana, Gujarat, Maharashtra. If it wants to alter the boundaries of any state, it has complete authority to do so, but then this should be based on an act of the Parliament. Last but not the least, alter the name of any state. Mind you, in any of these things, it is considered to be through a simple majority in the Parliament. So therefore, this is through an act of the parliament. There is no constitutional amendment. There is no constitutional amendment in doing any of these things. This is one important thing which all of us need to understand. So therefore, even when Telangana was created, or Chhattisgarh was created, or when Jharkhand was created, or any new state would be created in the near future or in the future, it does not require any constitutional amendment. It merely requires an act of the parliament. So let's try to understand its procedure. So how does it get into it? Now, what's the process into it? So what are the bill to form a new state or diminish the area of the state, increase the area of the state, alter the name of the state? First of all, the bill has to be introduced in the parliament with a prior recommendation of the president. Without the prior recommendation of the president, the bill can never be introduced in the parliament. This is very, very important. Okay. And what the president does immediately, he will send this to the concerned state legislature. Concerned state legislature, it's already written here. He sends this to the concerned state legislature, giving them a time period to express their opinion. Now, what he does is, once he introduces the bill, he gives this to the concerned state legislature. For example, when Telangana was supposed to be created, now this was informed to the state legislature assembly of Andhra Pradesh to provide their opinion within such and such a date. Now, how much time it is, it's decided by the president. The Constitution of India has not said anything about it. So please do keep this in mind. The Constitution does not prescribe 15 days or 21 days or 30 days here. It is as decided by the president. So if you assume that the Constitution has created this 15 or 21 or 30 days, it's your assumption. The Constitution has not given any stipulated days with respect to it. So therefore, if the president gives 15 days or 21 days, within this 15 days or 21 days, they should give their opinion. What if they don't give their opinion? It's up to the president to decide what he feels like. Right? It is dependent on the parliament. Well, he can still go ahead with the bill which has to be passed in the parliament. Okay, and if the parliament, both the houses of the parliament passes this with a simple majority, and after which the president signs it, then it means that a new state is born, or it has altered the boundaries of the state, or it has increased the area of the state, or diminished the area of the state, or altered the name of a state. So this is the process of creation of any state in the case of India. Okay. So again, I repeat, there is no constitutional amendment. The bill has to be introduced in the parliament with the prior recommendations of the president, which is compulsory. Without the prior recommendations of the president, the bill cannot be introduced in the Parliament of India. And once he does it, he will inform this, seeking the public opinion or the opinion of this concerned state legislative assembly, which gets affected by this. And once the concerned state legislative assembly gives its opinion, it's not binding on the president. It's not binding on the parliament to take the same advice. The parliament and the president can take a different altogether. They can act otherwise. It's all dependent on the parliament. So the parliament has the power to decide on new states in India. It's very simple. Okay, let's move ahead with the next important thing. Okay, so talking about the power of ceding territory, we had already discussed about the Berubari case, in case of the preamble. Especially we were discussing about the Keshwananda Bharati case, and then before that we discussed about the Berubari case. The reason why I said about the Berubari case is about the preamble is because now there was a question whether preamble was a part of Indian Constitution or was it not a part of the Indian Constitution. So initially the Supreme Court felt that it was not part of the Indian Constitution, and then it was reversed in the Keshwananda Bharati case. But then in the 1960 Berubari case was little interesting, because nowhere the Constitution of India had provided the Parliament's authority or its power to cede a territory of India to a foreign territory, right? So therefore, in the Berubari case, they had to do a constitutional amendment, and the effect of that was the 9th constitutional amendment. So you had the 9th constitutional amendment, which made sure that there was and constitutional amendment to cede the territory of India. While there was a judgment which was made by the Supreme Court in 1969, which very clearly said that with respect to any border dispute, right, wherein both parties had to decide on some of the border disputes and the border conflicts, it's not necessary to create a constitutional amendment. But then before that, in the 9th constitutional amendment, we had ceded a territory to a foreign country, and that's Pakistan there. And of course, post 1969, the settlement of the border dispute, the Supreme Court very clearly said that you don't require a constitutional amendment at all. So this is missing in the case of the constitutional provision. So therefore, you should keep it in mind that the state, especially, or the central government, it does not have any power to cede Indian territory to any foreign country. So if that has to be done, it has to be done through a constitutional amendment. Supposing if it is a border dispute, then no constitutional amendment is required. So this is what we need to understand. Okay, let's move ahead with the next important thing. So evolution of states and union territories in case of India. So how did it all start? Of course, we all know that we had 4 classification of the states, and they were called as A, B, C, D. Initially it was provinces, princely states, and then chief administrator ruled states, and then there are certain states which are called as class D states, right? So we had group A, that is classification A, classification B, classification C, and also classification D. Of course, talking about the provinces were ruled by the governors. Okay, and they were in turn controlled by the Governor General. While the princely states were those states which are ruled by Raj Pramukh, basically a king, a Maharaja, and he used to directly report it to the Governor General. So the Governor General used to control the princely state through the Raj Pramukh. So the Raj Pramukh was a puppet under the hands of the Governor General. While Class C and Class D is the states where we normally see a chief administrator, or we see a separate autonomous status which was given for smallest territory, like that of Andaman and Nicobar, like that of Coorg, like that of Cooch Behar. These were some of the states which went in Class C and Class D. So what happened initially after independence? There was a Herculean task for the first government to reorganize these states and the union territories. Well, initially Congress created a committee which is called as JVP committee, and finally a commission was also created called as Dar Commission. Now both of them always felt that it should be based on administrative efficacy, but they should also give importance to that of language. Based on this, there are a lot of tussle amongst various states that they need a statehood based on the language. In fact, Andhra Pradesh was the first state which was carved out based on the language. So, well, in order to take a cognizance of all of this, what the first government did was it created a commission called as the State Reorganization Commission. And the State Reorganization Commission was created in the year 1953. And this is called as the Fazl Ali Commission. Well, Fazl Ali Commission took the cognizance of certain important criteria in order to carve out, states, reorganize the states. Of course, the British had reorganized or organized the states for their own administrative efficacy, for their own selfishness motive, for their own motive, basically. And in some cases, it was basically to help them to exploit the resources of Indians and also the resources which was there in India. It might be geographical or economical or financial and so on and so forth. Well, one of the biggest challenge was unity and integrity. So if the reorganization of the states has to be done, there should not be any compromise on the unity and integrity of India, because now this might create into some sort of regionalism, or it might create into some kind of separatism and so on. So this was one of the biggest challenge what the Fazl Ali Commission had. The second important criteria what they had to take into consideration was the language. It's because most of these states were asking the government to take the criteria of language and create a statehood, reorganize the state and redraw the boundaries of the state, and also the cultural identity. So therefore, one of the other criteria which the Fazl Ali Commission took into consideration was the language and the cultural identity. Now, these two, apart from that, there is something called as administrative efficacy. Now it should not create a burden to the center, neither it shall create a burden for the financial expenditure. So the financial aspects and the review of the financial situation was also taken into consideration. And finally, the welfare of the state and the law and order situations. All of that was some of the criteria which the Fazal Ali Commission took into consideration, and then the state reorganization was done. And finally, in the 1956, the State Reorganization Act was passed, and language was considered as one of the important criteria, along with that of administrative efficacy, unity and integrity, and overcoming the problems of regionalism and favoritism and also separatism was taken into consideration. So this is how the states and union territories was evolved. Moving ahead, now talking about the union territories, each union territory is based on a reason. Okay, so let's say that you have one of the most important union territory, and that's New Delhi. So why this is a union territory? This is a union territory because this is a national capital region. That's the reason why it is a union territory. The second one is Chandigarh. Why this is a union territory? Chandigarh is a union territory is basically because Chandigarh was supposed to be a capital of Punjab, but Haryana opposed to it. So therefore, since two of these states were quarreling to each other, therefore the central government converted this into a union territory. The Punjab Accord said that Chandigarh happened to go to Punjab. However, Haryana again opposed to it. Next, number 3, you have Pondicherry, or also called as Puducherry. Pondicherry comprises of Mahe, Yanam and Karaikal. In fact, if it was supposed to be given to the adjacent states, the other states would always question. So therefore, since it was a French territory altogether, and it was given to us based on the French settlement, so therefore it was converted into a union territory. Number 4, Daman Diu, Dadra and Nagar Haveli. This was a small region, and in fact in 2019 this was amalgamated into one single union territory because of administrative reasons. See, if a small territory is being given a statehood, it will always be a financial expenditure on the central government, and it will also create some sort of vacuum for the central government in order to allocate some set of fresh financial resources. So it will be a burden for the central government. So since it is the smallest region, so therefore the central government can easily control them. So Daman and Diu, Dadra and Nagar Haveli was converted into one single union territory, and it is a union territory basically because it cannot be given a statehood altogether, because the piece of land and the population what they have is lesser. That's the reason. Next, talking about these two, Lakshadweep and Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Now these two are union territories because they are little away from India. So one of the most important question which comes into is the security, right? And these two, wherever there is a sea or a port, wherever there is a sea, there is a port. And of course, wherever there is a port, you'll always see some sort of unnatural activities. Sometimes it also happens of problems on law and order. There'll be a threat on the security of India. So therefore, in order to control all of this, this was kept under the center. Lakshadweep, Andaman and Nicobar Islands, this was little away from India, mainland of India basically. So these are little away from the mainland of India. Taking the security into consideration, taking the cognizance of the security into consideration, these two was converted into a union territory. Earlier they were into Class C classification, so therefore they were definitely converted into a union territory because India did not want to undermine the security of these two regions. Number 7 and number 8 is J&K, that's Jammu and Kashmir, and 8 is Ladakh. Okay, so these two are a union territory. As you all know that Article 370 was abrogated, right? When Article 370 was abrogated, automatically Article 35A was also cancelled, abrogated. You should not go into a misconception that Article 370 is abrogated, meaning it's not there in the Indian Constitution. No. It is there in the Indian Constitution. Only thing is the provisions are suspended. So the President, through a special order, can definitely, reinforce Article 370 or Article 35A. Okay, I repeat this. Parliament does not have any question in this. Of course, what the Parliament did was, Parliament passed the J&K State Reorganization Act. Now, why did they do it? They wanted to convert a state into a union territory. Article number 3, you all know about it. So they can definitely alter the boundary of the state. So they can create any new state or they create any union territory. So what they did was, through the state reorganization, what they did was, J&K State Reorganization Act, basically it is an act. J&K and Ladakh was created. But then they abrogated Article 370 and Article 35A is because it was a temporary provisions given in the Indian Constitution. The President of India, the Honorable President of India, through a presidential order, can definitely reinforce it or he can suspend it. So now it is on the suspension. So these are the 8 union territories, and all these 8 union territories are based on a reason. So these are the reason why these union territories are created. So let's move ahead with the next important thing. So whenever we speak about the union territories, there should be a comparison, and there is always a comparison between New Delhi and Pondicherry. And a lot of developments did also happen with respect to New Delhi related to Lieutenant Governor and also the Chief Minister of New Delhi. And you all know that the Chief Minister of New Delhi is constantly in news. And recently he was granted an interim bail. And that's today, when I'm recording today. So he's been already granted an interim bail by the Honorable Supreme Court of India. Anyway, there's not the time to discuss about the politics here. Let's try to discuss about the constitutional provisions and also the act which was made by the Parliament related to the administration of New Delhi and also Pondicherry. First of all, to talk about New Delhi, see, both of them, the Union Territory Act of 1963 covers almost all union territories, irrespective of whichever union territory it is. However, what we need to understand is, with respect to New Delhi, the power of Lieutenant Governor is absolute with respect to police, law and order and land. Now, which is not to be seen in the case of Pondicherry. This is very, very important. In fact, this is more strengthened by passing by the Parliament. The Parliament has strengthened this more, and you also see the developments which is happening related to it in the past 1 year. Right? So the Lieutenant Governor has the complete authority. So when I say the Lieutenant Governor here is the Parliament of India, the central government. The central government tries to control the police, and it has the control of police, law and order and the land with respect to New Delhi. While with respect to Pondicherry, the Lieutenant Governor does not have any such function. So it is based on the aid and advice of Council of Ministers headed by the CM. Chief Minister. Okay, so there is a logic why this is being done. Let's not take politics into it. The logic is basically New Delhi is a national capital region, and you'll find the entire central secretariat, including the PMO, the Prime Minister, every single ministries and departments are present in New Delhi. You cannot give the complete administration of certain important subjects in the hands of a state or any state administration. Therefore, it is logical on the hands of the central government to keep the police, law and order and the land. So this is a logical and the rational justification. So let's not bring politics here. So let's go by logic. However, you should also understand that in the other union territory, it is not applicable is basically because now in these union territories, you will not find the PMO or the entire ministries or the entire central secretariat being present there. So that's the logic behind it. Okay. So the second important difference is the Government of National Territory Act of 1991 and the Transaction of Business Rules of 1993 is applicable for New Delhi. right? And also the Union Territory Act of 1963. The Union Territory Act of 1963 speaks about the distribution of powers between the center and the state, especially the Union Territories and the center. Now, as the name itself suggests, what is the difference between the the state government and the Union Territory? The state government share the federal distribution of power. The Union Territories will not. This is very, very important. Union Territories, as the name itself suggests, it is under the central government. It is centrally administered regions. However, there are 3 important state legislative assemblies, now adding on to Jammu and Kashmir, which will have a chief minister along with that of Council of Ministers to exercise their own independent function, is basically because these union territories have more population, and the territory is also more. That's the area is also more. So therefore, it's logical to provide representation. Therefore, there is a ministry. Therefore, this act, that is Union Territory Act of 1963, provides for the distribution of power between the Union Territory and also the central government with the help of creation of a state legislative assembly and also the ministries, especially the chief minister. So this is a logical explanation to understand why Delhi and Pondicherry has a chief minister and the council of minister. All right. Well, you have Article 239 and Article 239AA. Well, 239AA provides for a restriction on all legislative assembly in the case of New Delhi, and it's applicable only for New Delhi. No such restriction is provided on the legislative proposals on New Delhi, and Article 239 provides authority to the Lieutenant Governor and the Chief Administrator to control and work in the superintendence of the central government, especially he or she becomes the administrative authority of the respective region. So therefore, these are the comparison between Delhi and Pondicherry. So the very first comparison is extremely important. That's on the power of legislature. So both of them also have the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers headed by the Chief Minister, but then it's more in the case of Pondicherry, less in the case of Delhi, because in case of Delhi, the Delhi Lieutenant Governor has complete control over police, law and order, and also land. Okay, so this is about the union territories and also the states. So let's move on with the next topic.